I'm trying to get in contact with them after an experience I had with one of the carnival rides they manufactured. I went back today and the whole unit was missing. I had written down the number from the information on the side of the ride, the only reason I know their name at all, but it's out of service. Last night, I had taken my wife and daughter to the local fair. It's early in the season and lightly rained throughout the night, which kept the crowd down. The rain wasn't enough to close any of the rides, so we had a fantastic time. My daughter was able to go on all her favourite rides multiple times in a row. My wife isn't as big on the rides, but was happy to eat their food and play games, so we split up often to do our own things. At the end of the night, we were tired, but completely satisfied. We were on our way out, but still looking around for anything cheap to spend our remaining tickets on. This fair wasn't like any other I'd ever been to. You can't just buy your way onto a ride. You have to buy tickets, and then the rides usually cost a number of tickets, like 18 or 27, depending on their size and popularity. Thus, you are always left with a few tickets at the end, an incentive to buy another roll or come back another day. I had no tickets left, while Alison had just 5. My wife had 20, and quickly found a horseshoe throwing game that she resolved to spend it all on. So, my daughter and I searched high and low for anything that just costs 5 tickets. My hopes weren't high. The only thing I'd seen at that price were baby rides. Alison had just turned 10 years old, and reaching double digits had done amazing things for her maturity. I knew better to even suggest she go on one of those rides. But then, Alison screamed with delight as she ran past me to the edge of the fair. There was a long hall with a spinning hamster wheel, maze of glass walls and dangling, colourful punching bags. Bright lights lit up the whole thing, and a nearby sign advertised the price of a mere 5 tickets. I caught up to Alison just as she was giving her last ticket to the fair employee. He was an older man who looked more tired than I felt, but he smiled when he saw me and asked, "Want to brave the maze?" My daughter tugged at my hand and said, "Yeah, come on, Daddy." I resisted her pull and explained to the both of them, "Sorry, I don't have any tickets left." The old man winked and said, "No problem, Daddy. You can go on. Keep an eye on the girl. Safety first." I thanked him and let Alison pull me towards the start of the maze. At first, I thought we were going to get our money's worth. We breezed through the first section of the glass walls, and I let Alison run on the hamster wheel for a while. Then we moved on, and I realised we were being funneled to the back wall, which Alison pushed open to reveal a room lit only by black lights. She ran ahead and immediately into a glass wall. I lightly chided, "Be careful, the maze probably continues all throughout this back part." But she was already running ahead, giggling the whole time. I tried to keep up, but I was quickly finding myself confused by the invisible walls in this low light. Alison disappeared from view, but I could still hear her close. She must have been getting lucky to find the right path forward, because I had to double back several times. I started to panic a little, even though my little girl was clearly more capable at this than I was. My hands remained constantly outstretched in anticipation of each new wall. Then I heard Alison from behind me. I whipped around, but didn't see her. She was calling out for me. "Daddy, where are you?" This broke my heart a little, so I ran forward and immediately into another glass wall. It was surprisingly sturdy, yet unyielding. I bounced off and went around while yelling, "Alison, stay put, I'll be right there." I was a little shocked when she popped up to my right and said, "No need to shout, Dad, I'm right here." I turned to give her a hug, but another glass wall separated us. She put her hands on it, and I covered it with my own on my side. Her hand seemed so tiny next to mine. She asked, "Hey, how do you get ahead of me?" "We'll have to be careful. This maze is tricky. I think the room was designed to bounce sound around too." "No, really, you were just behind me. How are you so fast?" I tried following the glass around to find a corner I could turn, but it stayed a straight wall for as far as I could reach while keeping the conversation going. "I was behind you, trying to keep up. You must have doubled back without noticing." "No, I mean, just now. Dad, I don't think you're alone in here. There was another man behind me. I just assumed it was you." "Oh, you don't need to get too worried. This is a public event after all. He's just another patron of the fair, and that's all." Despite my outwardly calm demeanor, I was freaking out inside. If I hadn't already confirmed how tough these walls were, I might have tried breaking through right then and there. Instead, I asked her to stay put while I tried to work my way around her and keep her in view. After a few minutes of failing, I thought it was best if she kept moving. I gave her final instructions to scream if any strangers approached her, and then we both hugged the glass in front of us. When she finally ran off, there was a trick of the light, and I thought I saw her reflection turn and run in the opposite direction. I didn't waste any time trying to understand this place. Clearly, it was designed to confuse. I raced around, trying to find the way back I came. The plan for me was to exit any way I could and ask the attendant to turn on the lights, keep an eye out for my daughter, and I could enter through the exit and hopefully encounter her quickly. But I couldn't find a way out. The maze twisted and turned and kept taking me further and further from where I thought I needed to go. The walls went all the way up to the ceiling. I could reach up and touch it easily, but this still seemed too over-engineered for a cheap theme park. I was almost crying with frustration when I started to catch glimpses of her everywhere. I abandoned all strategy as I hurried in just about every direction that I last saw her. I just wanted to keep my daughter safe. Her voice kept popping off. That was the only way I can think to describe it. Sometimes she sounded like she was right behind me. Sometimes she sounded worlds away. And when I turned, there she was, 20 feet ahead and facing away from me. She screamed, and I instinctively ran forward to protect her, right into another wall. I knew right away that I had broken my nose. My eyes watered, and my throat choked a bit on the blood that was flowing in the wrong direction. I leaned my head forward as I felt with my hands around the wall in front of me. Luckily, this was the last obstacle between me and my little girl. My yelp of pain had alerted her, and she ran over and gave me a big hug. Of course, the first thing I had asked her was, "Are you okay? Why did you scream? Are you hurt?" She wiped away tears from her eyes, but was grinning wide, glad to be reunited. She answered, I'm fine, Daddy. I thought I heard you, so I stopped to listen close, and then you popped up in front of me." Confused, I walked forward, while looking at the glass wall she had previously been standing in front of. Then, my face popped up, looking in fright now with my nose already turning a darker colour and blood trails from both nostrils. I was looking at my reflection in the glass. I wondered how often I really caught glimpses of Alison during my wild chase. I never got a good look. I was probably just seeing parts of my face and body when the angle was just right. Now that we were together, I wasn't taking any chances. I held her hand tight while putting my hand on the right-hand wall. We walked around and around while my hand never lifted from the wall. Eventually, we made it out of the exit. My wife was waiting there, with a huge stuffed unicorn in her arms and a worried expression on her face. When she saw my face, she dropped the unicorn and ran over to see if I was okay. I gave her the condensed version. We had gotten a little lost in the surprisingly huge maze, but no real harm was done. All in all, we had spent 40 minutes in that horrible maze. I was feeling pretty silly, but I still wanted to complain to someone. The old man at the ticket booth was nowhere to be seen, but the entrance was already locked up, so we just left in the end. As we drove out of the parking lot, I started to worry if the misadventure was in any way traumatizing to Alison. She looked absolutely normal in the car's rearview mirror. We ended up driving near that maze on our way out, so I grabbed a notepad from the car's center console and scribbled out the name and number of the company I saw on the side. When I was done, I looked again in the mirror. I was even more worried now, as I struggled to understand a few confusing things. First, I was surprised to see the whole building was only 30 feet deep. It felt much larger when running around it. Also, the name on the side was the Maze of Mirrors, when it had clearly just been a maze of glass walls. And then my wife asked, "Hey, since when were you right-handed?" I'm an amateur astronomer. Very amateur. Don't get me wrong, I love stargazing, but I'm also your average millennial, deep in student debt, renting in a high cost of living area and working a dead-end, soul-crushing job. So I don't really have the time or the savings to sink into this hobby. Near Thanksgiving last year, my gran got me the best telescope she could afford for my birthday. The fact that she'd invest in a hobby of mine like that means so much to me, and I've been taking it out to stargaze as much as I can ever since. For the most part, it's been fun and exhilarating, and I've been learning a lot about the universe and our place in it. It's just so cool to drive out to the middle of nowhere and look up. Well, I guess I should say it was. Something happened in January that's making me question reality, that I just can't stop thinking about. In short, I saw something strange, something I can't explain. I'll get to that. First, for context, one of the things I really wanted to observe this year was the first full moon. It sounded like the title of a poorly translated anime. Super Blood Wolf Moon. It's pretty rare, so I wanted to do it justice by getting far from the glow of Denver and its several suburbs. I drove east, away from the Rockies, then south towards desert and desolation. Somewhere between Raton and Taos, I pulled over. It was nearing night by this point. The sun was just this slim, rust-red glow on the horizon that bled up to these vaporwave pinks and outrun purples. And it was quiet. So quiet. No buzz of city sounds, no planes droning above, in a holding pattern above DIA. Only the constant ebb and flow of a slight breeze and the chirp of a few steadfast crickets. In the distance, a pack of coyotes yipped and yelled. I kept my ears on them, trying to determine how far they were from me. I wasn't scared. Not really. Sure, I was alert and aware of my surroundings, but I wasn't scared. Ever since getting that telescope, I'd driven out to deserted and semi-deserted places alone plenty of times, and had come to recognize true danger from the false kind I invented in my head. It basically boiled down to trusting my gut. If my gut said go, I went. If it said get over it, I got over it. That night, my gut was saying all good. So, for hours, I watched the stars pop out against the dark sky, watched as they slid across it until they hit the light of the moon and disappeared, watching as the eclipse began. And for hours, nothing happened. At least, nothing scary or strange or supernatural. Just me looking up, watching the shadow of the earth sweep over the moon. Around 10 PM, there was the whoop whoop from the road and Pepsi-coloured lights swirl around me. The cops. Great. I'd dealt with the cops before while stargazing. Most of the time they were reasonable and let me off with a warning. Sometimes though, there'd be an asshole whose night was made by ruining mine. I stepped away from my telescope and walked back towards the road, hands clear by my side. 2 cops, a brawny man and a woman with charcoal colour hair, both in plain clothes and their badges and guns clear in sight, stepped out of an unmarked black SUV. They eyed me, obviously wary, so I waved, making sure both my hands were visible, silently cursing my luck and the way their lights ruined my night vision. "Car troubles?" the woman asked, shining her light in my face, then behind me towards the field. I'd attached reflectors along the length of my telescope and knew she could see them winking in the beam of the flashlight. "No ma'am, just observing the full moon," I pointed up. She lowered a light and smiled. A good sign. "Oh yeah, it's that one. What's it called? Super Blood Wolf Moon out tonight, right?" "That's right," I said, nodding. "Want to take a look?" Her partner made a small noise, and the woman looked over at him, then up at the moon. "Oh, what the hell," she said, and stepped off the road towards my telescope, stooping slightly to gaze through it. "Whoa," she said. "It's kinda creepy. Hey, wanna look?" She glanced at her partner. "Come on, it's cool." Her partner looked up at the sky like he was considering it, then said, "Sure." He stepped over and gazed through the telescope for longer than the woman had, but he seemed far less impressed when he pulled away. "Spooky," he said. The woman shot him a strange look before turning back to me. "Shouldn't stay out here too late," she said. I nodded. "I won't, just waiting till totality hits. I'll head out after that." "When is that?" she asked. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and glanced at it. No service, but the clock still worked. "About 20 minutes from now." "All right," she said. "Well, be careful. Coyotes and such, you know." I nodded again. "I know." The woman sighed and said, "All right." She turned towards her partner and added, "Come on, big guy, let's go." She walked back towards the SUV and stood, waiting by the driver's side door for him. The man hesitated, looking between me and his partner, like he wanted to say something. A few seconds later, he said, "Have a nice night." And they walked away too. I waved as the cops slid inside their SUV and waited for them to leave. They whooped their sirens again, flashed their lights, and pulled off, heading north. I watched them drive away for a few minutes before walking back towards my telescope. The light from the moon was slowly disappearing now, and the landscape around me was dark. I wasn't able to see much with my night vision ruined. On a whim, I decided to walk farther into the field and stare at the sky without any instruments. About 40 or 50 feet from my telescope and the road, it happened. I tripped and fell hard into the dirt. After a second of moaning in pain, I stood up and looked around, trying to figure out what I tripped over. I couldn't see in that darkness, so I pulled out a flashlight from my pocket and flicked it on. Almost immediately, I saw it. Despite the thick brush covering the field, it was hard to miss. A metal hatch. It was weird. I was out in the middle of nowhere and there were no structures, at least ones that I could see, anywhere around. The hatch was square with a tiny domed window near one side. It looked like it had come off the side of a submarine or something, and it looked old, like it had been out in that field for years. The metal was rusting, dull in the dim moonlight. I backed away, sweeping my light around the field, trying to see if there were any indications that somebody might be living nearby, like trash or footprints. But there was nothing. I was on edge now and decided it was time to leave. I turned back towards the road, towards my car and safety, but didn't get very far. I heard something I can only describe as tapping. It sounded strange, like when you hit one of those huge metal water tanks with a rock or your knuckles. The way the sound ricochets around it, all distorted and waterlogged. That's what this tapping sounded like. There were 3 quick taps, then a pause, then 3 more taps, but slower, longer. Another pause, 3 more taps, quick again. They were all insistent, all loud, all coming from the hatch. I stared down as I wondered if my fall had upset something inside. Maybe an animal had gotten trapped, or it was some sort of alarm system. I was scared now, sure, but I was also curious. Curiosity won. I flicked my flashlight back onto the hatch. The tapping sound stopped. "Hello? Is someone up there?" A voice. A damn voice. Something moved in the glass dome of the hatch, and I realized it was an eye. Bloodshot, and big, and blue. I think I screamed. I know I ran. Behind me, the voice called out again. It sounded odd, elongated and echoey, like whoever it was standing inside a water tank, or maybe a bunker. "Wait, wait," the voice pleaded. It sounded desperate. I stopped, half-turned, tried to hear over the sound of my own panicked breathing. "Please don't go, please." I took a step back towards it. "What the hell is going on? Who are you? What is this? Please, you have to let me out. Let me out, please. She'll be back soon." The eye was still watching me. It blinked. "Please," the voice said again. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, if they were young or old. That's how distorted their voice was. I only knew that it sounded human. "Open the hatch." I don't know. How do I was stuttering, scared, unable to think. I took a few steps towards the hatch and knelt next to it. "The lock," the voice said. "What?" The voice sounded panicked, shaky. There's a metal lock on the side of the hatch." I walked around the perimeter of the hatch slowly, shining my light down at it. The eyes squinted slightly in the light. Sure enough, there was a padlock on one side of it. It looked brand new. I bent down and jiggled it around a little bit, not really expecting it to budge. There was nothing else I could do, not without help or the right tools. I pulled my phone out of my pocket just to check. Still no service. I swallowed. "I'm sorry," I said. "I can't open it. I need to go get help or something. I'll be back, I promise." I stood up to leave. "No!" the voice screamed, mad with panic. "No, no, no! Don't leave me! Don't leave me!" "I'm sorry," I repeated. "I have to go. I have to go get help. I'll be back. I swear. I swear." "No, no, no! Please, please!" Whoever was down there started pounding at the hatch. Pounding and pounding. It was so loud. I stood up and backed away, trying not to hyperventilate. "I'll be back. I promise. I promise." There was a whoop whoop from behind me, and I looked towards the road. The cops. I half ran, half stumbled towards them. It was the same cops as before. They were already out of their SUV and walking towards me. Both of them had flashlights this time, but they pointed them towards the ground, away from my face. "Hey," the woman said. "Thought we'd come up and watch the totality with you. Hope that's... What's wrong? What happened?" There's a person," I said breathlessly. "There's a person, underground, in a hatch. They're trapped." The cops glanced at each other, then back at me. "What do you mean?" the woman asked. I caught my breath, then said, "There's a weird metal hatch thing over there. I tripped over it, and there's someone inside. They're trapped." A metal hatch? It was the male cop. He shined his light over towards the field. "Yeah, you know, like something that'll be on a ship, with one of those glass dome window things." The man raised an eyebrow and said, "A porthole?" A slight smile flashed onto his face, like he was amused. Yes, whatever. I don't care what it's called. There's someone out there, in a damn bunker or something. What the hell are you guys doing still standing here?" I gestured at the field. My telescope was still there, about 10 feet from the road. The two cops looked at the field, then at each other, then back at me. The woman spoke this time. "Have you had any illegal substances tonight?" "What? No. There's someone out there, in the damn field. What are you waiting for? Come on, I'll show you." "Sir," the woman said. "Sir, stop, okay? We're going to need you to calm down. Take some breaths, deep breaths. Good. Now, slower this time. Repeat what you said. You saw something strange in the field?" I nodded. Yes, this metal..." I struggled to find the right words and flailed my arms around, desperately trying to describe it. "Hatch thing, like a door to a bunker or a submarine or something, and there's someone inside it, a person. They were asking me to help them. They need help." I paused, took a deep breath. "And there was a padlock on one side of it. It looked new." The cops glanced at each other again. They looked totally unfazed. "You want to check it out?" the man said to the woman. "I got the last one." The woman scowled at him and then sighed. "Yeah, sure. You'll be here?" This time he did smile. He nodded and said, "Always." The woman shook her head and rolled her eyes towards the sky before turning back to me. I looked between them, unable to figure out what the hell was going on. Why were they acting so nonchalant? What did the man mean by this one? Had this happened before? Or was he just referring to them checking out weird stuff in general? I didn't know then. I still don't know now. Go on, the woman said, snapping me out of my thoughts. My partner will wait here with you, okay? I'll go check it out. Can you point in the general direction of what you saw? Yes, I can. I turned and pointed towards my telescope. It was like 40, 50 feet north of my telescope, in the brush. It's sticking out a few inches from the ground. It's hard to miss. The woman shined a light in that direction and said, "All right." Then, without another word, she started walking towards the way I pointed, sweeping her light in smooth, consistent arcs across the ground. When she got about 50 feet from my telescope, she stopped and knelt down. "Did you find it?" I yelled out to her. "No, there's nothing out here," she called back. In the dim moonlight, I could see her stand up and kick the ground with a boot. What? I looked at the man who looked back at me. He was leaning against the SUV with his arms crossed. His face was completely impassive. "She said, there's nothing out there," he said. "What do you mean there's nothing out there?" I think I was yelling, but I'm not sure. I don't really remember. Without stopping to think, I said, "I'll show you," and took off towards the direction of the woman. In retrospect, I realized how stupid this was. Both cops were armed, and I was acting erratic, irrational. The man immediately took off after me, and I could hear him crashing through the brush as I ran over to where the hatch was, repeatedly saying, "Stop, stop," trying to get me to stop or slow down. I did neither. The woman's left hand hovered over a pistol as I approached. "Stop," she said. I ignored her and kept going. Stupid, I know, but I couldn't believe that there was nothing there. I wanted to show her she was wrong, that the person in the hatch, whoever they were, needed our help. It didn't occur to me to question why that person wasn't making any noise now or calling out for help. The woman sighed and shined a flashlight back at the ground, helping me look. But the hatch, it wasn't there. It was like some badly written urban legend. The vanishing hatch and the mysterious voice. I could clearly see the imprint of my ass in the dirt, proof I tripped over something. But the hatch was gone, vanished. It was impossible. It was right there. I knelt down and brushed at the dirt with my hands. "Look," I said, pointing at the spot where I fell. "You can see that I fell, right there, tripped over the hatch and fell. Where the hell is it? It has to be here." "Sir," the woman said again, but this time she sounded mad. "I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but you got about 3 seconds to explain yourself." I looked up at her. I was still kneeling in the dirt. "You don't believe me?" "Believe what?" she asked, stretching her arms out wide. "That there's someone locked away out here, underground, in the middle of nowhere?" She shook her head. "You probably just fell asleep, had a bad dream. That, or you lied to us." I stood up and said, "Lied?" "Yeah," she said, "about the illegal substances." I looked at her, then at her partner. He was standing next to me, hands in his pockets, looking up at the sky, like he really didn't want to be there. Like he didn't give a damn. "Seriously?" I asked. The woman nodded. No, I don't do drugs. I don't even drink, for goodness sake." She raised an eyebrow, and I took a deep breath. "Look, I know what I heard. I know what I saw. There was someone out here. A metal hatch with a lock on the side of it. It has to be around here somewhere. We should keep looking." "Hey," the woman said, "I'm not going to tell you again." Her partner looked down from the stars and cleared his throat loudly, cutting her off. "I think," he said, that we should all just calm down, okay? Look, I'm sure you, think you saw something. Whether you fell asleep or were doing something you, shouldn't be doing. Something happened. I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up his hand and continued. Here's the thing. I'm not really in the mood for this tonight, so we're gonna let you off this time, okay? Let's just pretend this never happened. Go home, get some rest. Clearly you need it. Without looking at her, he asked his partner, That okay with you? She shot him a look I can only describe as pure hatred, then turned and said to me, You got lucky this time. If this behemoth wasn't here with me, well, who knows. Alright, come on, let's get out of here. But, I began. The man cut me off. Stop, he said. We have things to do, places to be, people to book. Either you take my offer and leave, or my partner here will deal with you. You wouldn't mind taking the time to do that, would you? He asked his partner. The woman smirked. Not one bit. So, the man said, turning back to me, what's it gonna be? I hesitated, then said, I'll go. Great, the man said. Then he looked up and added, Sorry you had to miss your totality. I glanced at him, confused. It was just an odd thing to say. The woman rolled her eyes at him and said, We going now or what? The man helped me pack up my telescope and load it into my truck. He apologized again, then told me to get home safe. Both cops stood outside their SUV, watching as I drove away. Look, I know it's been a long, long while since this happened, but I can't stop thinking about it. I have so many questions. I know what I saw, and I know I'm not crazy. There has to be some sort of explanation. So, I've decided. I'm going to drive out there in maybe a few weeks to check it out again. Not the best idea, but I just can't help myself. I just want to know. I need to know. Halloween as a concept is not particularly new. In fact, it's very, very old. It's also not a distinctly Western holiday. I mean, yes, Halloween as we know it, with all the candy and dressing up and carving pumpkins, those are all pretty much exclusively European. The idea behind Halloween, though, is fairly ubiquitous. Plenty of cultures celebrate a time of year when our world and the spirit world draws closer together. Most people view this one of two ways. Either it's a time when loved ones and long-lost family members come back to us, like Day of the Dead, or it's a time where we put up a bunch of protective rituals to keep away things that go bump in the night. Halloween falls into the second category, which is why we wear masks and make jack-o'-lanterns to keep the malevolent spirits away. I can tell you, without hesitation, that both interpretations are correct. The story I'm about to tell you took place when I was a teenager. I was living with my family. It was me, my two parents, my older brother and sister, and my grandmother. I'd had a younger sister too, but she and my grandfather both died in a car accident several years earlier. We moved houses not long after. Our new house was much bigger. I think having a smaller, cozier house would have let us feel their absence too easily. In a large home, we could just dismiss their absence as them being in another room, even if we knew they weren't. Anyway, one Halloween, our whole family, minus Grandma, was gathered into the living room, where we had a lit fire and put a movie on for the evening. It was late, and the trick-or-treaters were starting to thin out. The movie was a bit of a lull. and there came a shriek from upstairs. Instantly, we all knew it was Grandma who had screamed, so we all ran up in a panic. As we climbed the stairs, we could hear her sobbing and saying, "It's you! It's really, really you!" She kept repeating that in a sort of hoarse cry as we made our way to her room. When we got there, she had fallen down onto the floor with her back against the wall, and she looked paler than any of us had ever seen her. Tears streaked her face, and her breath was ragged, but her expression was a mixture of bliss and excitement. Standing across the room, dressed in an old-fashioned suit and with a hat in his hands in front of him, stood my grandfather. I'm sure I don't have to tell you how stunned we all were. None of us were particularly superstitious, and even if we were, that's just not the sort of thing you'd ever expect to come across. Had I known then what I know now, I would have ordered him, out of our house that very minute. But I didn't. My mother was the first one to break down. Seeing her father again brought her to tears immediately. But my grandfather simply smiled and reassured her. We spoke for what felt like hours, hearing the story of how Grandma was in her room getting ready for bed when she heard a tapping on the window. When she turned, she saw his face there, peeking at her. She explained that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. When you lose someone you love, you see them everywhere. But when he didn't leave and motioned for her to open the window, then climbed inside once she had, Grandma knew it wasn't the same. That was when she screamed and we came in. After that, my grandfather regaled us with tales of the other side. How beautiful it is. How all your wildest dreams can't compare to the reality of it. I like to tell you that I was skeptical, but I was just happy to see my grandpa again. He explained how, when the time is right, spirits can come back to the land of the living, and there was so much superstition and ritual going on during the Halloween that the barrier between our worlds grew thin. He apologized for not visiting sooner, claiming that he had tried many times, but that he simply hadn't been experienced enough until this year. And we all believed him. Once all this was finished, we agreed it was best if we left my grandparents alone to catch up. Grandpa stood up, turned to my grandmother, and reached out his hand. "I've got something to tell you. Come with me." He smiled as he said this, a warm, friendly smile. She took his hand, and together they walked down the hall and out of our sight. The rest of us went back downstairs, still shaken by what had occurred. We spent a long time in silence there, by the fire. Trick-or-treaters would still drop by, even more infrequently than before. Eventually, we got back to talking and joking, almost as though there weren't a ghost upstairs. It was the best night we'd spent together in years. Mother was just telling us a story about Grandpa when he was her age, and the doorbell rang again. It was now going 11 o'clock, so we weren't expecting any more children. A cry of "trick or treat" came from outside our door, though, so my mother stopped her story and went to the door. My mom loved children. She peeked out our front door window and caught just a glimpse of the young girl standing there in a pink princess outfit. She swung the door open, not even waiting to get a full view of the girl before complimenting her costume. "Well, don't you just look adorable?" There was the sound of a bowl hitting the floor, and my mother froze mid-sentence. "What's wrong, Mummy?" The voice didn't come from any of us. It came from outside. My father, my older siblings and I all looked at each other, before racing to the front door. When I got there, my heart leaped into my throat and tears filled my eyes. Standing in the doorway was my younger sister, Sarah. Sarah, who had been killed in a car crash years earlier. Those of you who have shared a house with a young child can imagine how deeply their absence is felt. There is no aspect of life they don't affect in one way or another. And when she died, nothing was the same. And there she stood, not a day older, and not a mark on her body. I broke down crying. When I looked around, I saw that all my family was crying, and Sarah looked deeply troubled by it. "Did I do something wrong, Mummy?" That voice snapped us all back to the moment. "Of course you didn't, sweetie," my mother replied hurriedly, adding, "We just missed you. Can I come in now?" We let her in, of course. The family then talked as we hadn't talked in years. Sarah was just the same as she ever had been. Back then, I would have called her annoying, but that night, she couldn't have annoyed me if she tried. Once we had been together for half an hour or so, Sarah looked towards my parents. "Mom, Dad, can I show you something?" "Of course you can, honey," my mother breathed. She still had tears in her eyes. Sarah leapt off the couch. "Great, come with me," she said, holding out both her hands for my mother and father to take. Suddenly, I realized that Grandma was still upstairs and had no idea that Sarah had come back. So I went upstairs to go get her. When I got upstairs, I saw my grandfather coming out of a room quietly and shutting the door behind him. When I asked where Grandma was, he told me she was resting. I asked if she could come downstairs, and he simply said that wouldn't be possible, before adding that she would have plenty of time to spend with Sarah. I was excited. Did this mean they were staying with us? I asked my grandfather, and he just smiled and went downstairs with me. My older siblings were chatting in the living room when Sarah came skipping in from around the corner. "Where are Mom and Dad?" I asked. "Well, when we went to the basement, they started kissing and hugging and told me to go back upstairs, so I did." That didn't sound right. I couldn't imagine my mother leaving Sarah's side for a moment tonight. Nobody else seemed to find that strange, though. Grandpa just laughed and said that adults were weird and that I'd understand someday. Then he turned to my brother and said he had brought a gift for him, something to make up for all the lost birthdays and Christmases. He held out his hand for my brother to take. "Come with me." It was only at this point that I grew suspicious. I asked Grandpa where my gift was, to which he simply said, "Oh, don't worry, you'll get yours soon enough." I urged my brother not to go with him, but he didn't listen. Taking my grandfather's hand, the two of them went down the hall together. Sarah turned to us and said, "Mummy and Daddy have been down there a while. Let's go check on them." She reached out for us. "Come with me." My older sister reached for Sarah, but I slapped her hand away. "Billy, what the—" "Don't go with her," I begged. "Come on, Meg," Sarah said. "Billy just doesn't want to see Mom and Dad kissing." Before I could stop her, Meg took Sarah's hand and the two of them went downstairs to the basement. Grandpa started coming back down the hall alone. His eyes met mine. "I've got your gift now, Billy. Come with me." I ran past him into my room and shut the door behind me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a cell phone yet, and there was no home phones in my room. They hadn't been openly violent yet, but how long was that going to last? All I could do was sit there and wait for them to either break in or leave. Heavy footsteps came down the hall and stopped just outside my door. My grandfather began calling me, begging me to come out so he could give me my present. A few minutes later, his voice was joined by Sarah's, asking me to come out and play with her. "Why don't you love me anymore, Billy? What did I do wrong?" She sounded like she was on the verge of tears. I can't possibly tell you how hard it was to stay in there, listening to my little sister beg me to play with her one last time. But the survival instinct is a strong one, and I kept the door shut. The clock chimed 12, and all fell silent. I looked under the door, and my grandfather's figure was no longer casting a shadow underneath. I placed my ear to the door, listening carefully. I heard nothing. My family was out there, possibly hurt. I had to go check or call for help, do something at least. I took a deep breath to steady myself and opened the door. The hallway was empty. Across the hall, through the open door, I could see my brother lying on the ground, motionless. He was pale, and it didn't look like he was breathing. I was only in high school, but I ran over to him, checked his wrists and his neck for a pulse, but found nothing. All I saw was that one of his hands was tinged black, as if necrotic. I ran upstairs. I should have called the police or an ambulance or somebody, but my mind wasn't working. I found Grandma in the same state. Pale, not breathing, her hands slightly blackened. My heart was racing. I couldn't go to the basement, because I knew what I would find there. The rest of my family, lying pale and motionless, dead. I sat there for a long time, paralyzed, before I decided that I had to know. The descent to the basement felt longer than it ever had before. I felt cold and numb, and each step felt like an eternity. But when I got to the bottom, I saw exactly what I knew I would find. My parents and my older sister all lying on the floor. I began to cry. Cry like I hadn't done in years. Like I hadn't since the day my little sister died. "You stupid boy." The voice was sinister and evil, sounding just like every demon from every horror movie you've ever seen, and worse. I spun around, and Sarah was there. But she was different. Her eyes were empty, and her mouth was a black, lipless hole ringed with fangs. "You have no more family, no more loved ones. They all came with me. They're mine now. And you will live the rest of your life alone. You will die somewhere, forgotten, alone and afraid. You will never see your family again. Ever." Then the thing paused and held out its hand. "Unless, of course, you come with me. You can be with us all again, forever." I'd like to tell you now that I kept my distance, that I told her to get out of my house, or at least that I sat frozen. But what she said was true. I felt it deep in my bones. I would never see my family again if I didn't go with her. I was just a kid. A scared, stupid kid who wanted his mom. I stood shakily and reached out my hand slowly. Sarah's mouth formed a sick facsimile of a smile as I approached. There was a noise upstairs. The clock chimed 1 o'clock, and I looked up, just for a heartbeat. there was a distant scream, and when I looked forward again, Sarah was gone. I called 911. It was eventually deemed that the family died of carbon monoxide poisoning and that the leak had spontaneously resolved itself and dispersed through my grandmother's open window. My experiences were brought on by the hysteria and oxygen deprivation. It could have been worse. They could have blamed me. I was legally an adult at that point, so the estate fell to me. I sold the house and everything in it and moved to a small apartment, using the proceeds to put myself through school once I graduated. If you see a loved one who has passed away this Halloween, please don't let them in. Don't take their hand, and never, ever go with them. You might be asking why I'm sharing this now. It's a fair question. For many years, I've been terrified of the things that came to my house that night. For decades, I thought that the scariest thing in the world was the idea that whatever came to visit, whatever we let into our home, they weren't my family. This year, though, I had a thought that was even more disturbing. What if they were? No amount of money in this world can justify a lifetime of nightmares, especially the kind that seep into the real world and cripple you with terror as soon as you wake up. Nightmares so violently distressing that you will never know for sure whether there's something in the dark lying in wait at your bedside until the dreadful, unavoidable moment comes where you'll be forced to turn on the lights and see for yourself. If I'd known back then what creating that stupid challenge would bring upon me, I would have kept my mouth shut. The small amount of money I won wasn't worth it, but it's far too late now to do anything about it. All that's left for me now is to try and live out the rest of my days as best as I can, knowing that someday, somehow, I will turn on the lights and find that thing there, waiting for me. There was this old, abandoned building right next to our school. I don't know exactly how long it had been abandoned for, but if I were to guess based on some old newspapers, candy wrappers and tons of other trash lying around, I'd say 20 years at the very least, maybe more. Despite the smell, the debris, the rats, and piles of trash, or even the occasional hobo turds, as weird as it might sound, every one of us loved that place. It was barely a couple of minutes away on foot from our school, so it was relatively easy for a lot of people to see it as an unofficial extension of school grounds. Whether it was to sneak away and have a few smokes during lunch break, make out, or just chill for a while after class, it was a place welcoming enough for pretty much anyone. There were enough different rooms throughout the building, varying in size, including a large oval room located on the first floor, which people usually try to avoid. It was more than enough to accommodate many groups of people all at once. These groups rarely interacted with one another, everyone mostly keeping it to themselves and their close circle of friends, but occasionally others would come by looking for a lighter or a cigarette someone could spare. Some of the faculty members were even said to hang in there sometimes, something I never witnessed myself, but they never berated us students for whatever we might be doing. They'd let us be. I mean, sure, we weren't on school property or anything, but it wasn't just that. Our teachers were cool. In fact, every other year, there were talks going around about acquiring the old building and turning it into official school property. We weren't exactly fond of the idea, because we liked that place for what it was, and how it was. Nonetheless, it was nice seeing that adults cared for it as well to some degree. We never stayed too long after dark, because an abandoned building during night is a whole different thing than it is during the day. It would get dark in there fairly quickly, and you could also feel the overall vibe shift almost instantly as people started feeling cold and somewhat uneasy. We never encountered any trouble there of any kind, but then again, we were also smart enough to not take our chances and overstay our welcome past a certain hour. That was until our last year of high school, when we came up with a survival horror kind of challenge one afternoon. It started out as a half joke, half dare, but then suddenly, everyone in the group started pitching in and structuring the idea from the ground up. At the time, I was somewhat proud of myself for being the main driving force that made the whole thing actually happen. We decided on a $10 entrance fee for whoever wanted in, and we ended up pooling together quite the appealing cash prize. From the moment you paid your fee, that money was gone and would never be returned to you under any circumstances, unless of course you turned out to be the winner. But the monetary prize wasn't enough, and I knew from the get-go that without an official set of rules, the whole thing wasn't going to last, as people would start complaining and whining to get their money back at every chance they got. With that in mind, I convinced them that this was in our best interest to establish some rules, just to make sure that nobody cheated and that everything turned out to be fair for everyone. Copies of the rulings were handed out and signed by everyone who was to take part in the challenge, as a sign of promise that they would abide by the rules. Deep down, I also knew that I had a big chance of actually winning the challenge, which is why I insisted an awful lot on the issue to begin with. I wanted to have as much fun as everyone else, but I also realized how easy it was for me to make money out of it. As for the challenge itself, it was essentially a try not to get scared kind of thing, meant to take place inside that same abandoned building in the form of trials. Each trial always featured 2 players chosen at random, with their roles also being assigned randomly as to give everyone a fair chance. One would have to try and scare the other with whatever means necessary, while the other player would have to try and, well, not get scared. Once the players were chosen, 2 variables were also determined randomly: the starting time of the trial, any time between 10 PM and 3 AM, as well as its duration, anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes. If any of the 2 players weren't there on the agreed starting time for whatever reason, they were automatically disqualified. Leaving the premises before the trial would disqualify you on the spot as well, regardless of your role. We also agreed on a sudden death kind of system. If a player failed to scare their opponent during the allotted time, or if a player ended up getting scared, that meant they were automatically out of the race. Again, no exceptions were to be made if we wanted it to work. The contestants, especially the ones trying not to get scared, were highly advised to bring a camera with them and record their own reaction as to avoid any he said she said. By having an actual form of evidence to back up their claims. Although there were some funny and memorable moments throughout the trials, I'll skip straight to the final one, the outcome of which would determine the winner. It was either going to be me or my friend Joshua. But before I do, I want to point out that by the time the 2 of us were the only players left, pretty much everyone else had lost interest in the outcome of the challenge. Many were mad for being disqualified after not showing up on time, which, I must admit, was something I expected to happen when it came to certain people, and the rest were either upset for having lost or worried about more important things such as exams, for example. So, because it was pretty much the 2 of us at that point, Joshua, who would be the one trying to scare me, decided to spice up the final trial by daring me to accept the following 3 rules. Rule number 1. The trial was to take place inside the large oval room located on the first floor of the building. Rule number 2. For the whole duration of the trial, I would have to remain seated on a chair, positioned at the very center of the room. And last but not least, the third rule stated that I was forbidden from talking or making a sound, and more importantly, I could never turn around or look behind me. If I were to break any of his rules, I would lose on the spot. You might be thinking I'd be an idiot to say yes and accept his conditions, especially when they clearly gave him the advantage. But the thing is, he said he'd put down an extra $100 if I did the same. The higher stakes would make for a far more personal and engaging duel for either of us, he said. I was in it mostly for the money after all, so how could I say no? Besides, it would prove to be a proper challenge, and the more money there was to be won, the more determined I was to win, no matter what. Being the lucky son of a gun he was, Joshua ended up having a full 90 minutes at his disposal to try and scare me somehow. What upset me the most, however, was the fact that the trial was scheduled to start at the latest possible hour, 3 in the morning. It wasn't particularly uplifting, especially when you consider that there hadn't been a single trial before ours that took place within that time frame. As a result, we had absolutely no idea whether it would be a safe environment for us to find ourselves in. On that night, I got there a little earlier than I anticipated. Around 2:15 AM, I think. I wanted to make sure I was there on time first and foremost, but I also had hopes of catching a glimpse of whatever Joshua had in store for me, and doing so might boost my chances of winning. I kept my distance as I scouted the exterior for a bit, but I didn't see any signs of him. I was slightly disappointed, but I decided to use the time I had left wisely and made my way inside. Entering that old building at night, and on my own, was much harder than I thought. Every step I took always made some kind of noise as things cracked under my shoes. It made me a little nervous because there was no way for me to know whether I was actually alone or not. The last thing I wanted was to wake up a crackhead with a needle stuck in their arm or come face to face with some shady activity going on. I didn't come across anything like that, so I made my way upstairs and into the designated area where the trial was to take place. There was nothing in the rules that stated that you couldn't be in the building way before the start of the trial, so if I happened to stumble upon Joshua as he was setting something up, I knew I wouldn't be the one at a disadvantage. As soon as I entered the oval room, I immediately noticed a wooden chair at its very center. Joshua had to be the one who put it there, which meant that not only had he already been there and likely done his preparations, but it also implied that he had arrived way before I did. I didn't like this one bit, because I suddenly felt like I had underestimated him, but I didn't let it get to me, in case he had been observing me since I got there. I still had a few minutes to kill before the trial officially started, so I didn't feel like I had any reason to worry. I walked around for a bit and looked for any other hints of his presence, like hidden props or some kind of device set to go off, but I didn't find anything whatsoever. Had it not been for the chair, I never would have guessed that Joshua had been the first to arrive. I then set up my own camera on a tripod in front of me, stuck a digital clock on top of it to keep track of the time, and finally sat down on the old chair. I was fully aware that I was to remain seated for the next hour and a half until 4:30 AM, but I was counting on Joshua giving up before then. I thought about bringing a book or something to entertain myself with, but ultimately decided against it. I felt like if I wanted to have the best chances, I had to remain focused throughout the entire thing. and letting myself get distracted might be enough for my opponent to swoop in for the win. So, instead, I tried my best to blend in and become one with the room I was in. I already knew that Joshua was probably going to leave me be at first, maybe in the hopes that the wait and anticipation would make me anxious and more susceptible to his tactics. But he was wrong. The longer he waited to make his move, the more I got used to my surroundings, which made me feel like I had the advantage over him. On top of that, knowing that someone was trying to scare me was enough to dial my senses up to 11 as well. I was wide awake and ready for whatever he had in store for me, confident that it wouldn't be enough to overcome my resolve. There was also no way I wouldn't notice him walk into the room, since there was only one way in, and I could easily detect all kinds of sounds and any sudden changes around me. There were 3 windows on the far wall in front of me, which barely provided the room with some light coming from outside. But I couldn't imagine Joshua making his entrance through one of them. Not only would it be dangerous, but I would also instantly see him coming in if he did. And he would lose any element of surprise he might have going for him. And yet, there wasn't a single sign of Joshua, even after nearly half an hour had passed. I was doing my best to stay focused, but I knew I was starting to get bored, which wasn't a good sign if I wanted to be in my best shape. And, to be honest, I was also getting a little anxious as well. Being on your own in such a derelict place, so late at night and for such an extended period of time, just isn't natural. It's not something that normal people usually do. It wears you down, and that got me thinking. Was he purposefully taking his time? Maybe trying to lure me into a false sense of security? Perhaps even waiting until the very last minutes of the trial to try and get me somehow? I wouldn't have put it past him to bet on me going through that paranoid line of thinking. So I closed my eyes in an attempt to clear my thoughts. I listened carefully to every sound in the air around me before trying to picture where they were coming from. This little exercise ended up giving some much needed peace of mind. When he told me I couldn't look behind me no matter what, he effectively made me unable to look at half of the entire room. But he probably didn't count on the fact that my ears would greatly make up for it. The sound of something crashing somewhere on the first floor startled me at first, but then I found it rather amusing. Idiot, I thought, thinking that Joshua had just given out his position by tripping over himself in the dark. I straightened myself in my chair with a grin as I checked on the time once again. 3:46 a.m. Only 44 minutes left. I then heard the sound of his footsteps, coming from down the hallway as he approached the room I was in. This wasn't surprising, considering the entire service floor of the building was littered with shards of glass, empty cans, gravel, and broken tiles, not to mention the odd piece of trash here and there left behind by squatters. It was straight up impossible to walk in there without making any sound, so it's no wonder that I heard him drawing closer every step of the way. He had no way of hiding his presence, but it also didn't seem like it was a concern for him. Maybe he was trying to play it cool and pretend that the crashing sound I heard had been intentional. Now that I knew he was finally coming out, I just had to prepare myself and not give in to whatever he had planned for me. The prize was as good as won, I thought. I just had to sit still and look straight into the camera in front of me, without making a peep or turning around, and that was it. That was all I had to do. The distinct sound of glass breaking under his feet indicated that he was now at the very entrance of the room, only a few dozen feet right behind me. He had stopped walking and stood there in silence, no doubt staring at me as I sat there with my back to him. He remained eerily quiet for a few minutes, and then, suddenly, without warning, he took off and started running. For a moment, I thought he might run straight towards me in an attempt to freak me out and make me jump out of my chair. But that's not what he did. He started running in a disturbing and erratic manner, but I never got to see it because it was all happening out of my sight, and I had agreed to the rules that stated I wouldn't turn around. I could only listen to the sounds of him crushing the trash under his feet and kicking dirt and dust in the air. He didn't appear to care for the ruckus he was making that echoed throughout the entire building, which made me feel quite uneasy, since it could attract plenty of unwanted attention. I then realized that there was more to that sense of unease that had been steadily growing in the pit of my stomach for a while. With me not actually being able to see anything, I had to rely on what I could hear, and from there, try and imagine what was really happening behind my back. Yet, the more I listened, the more anxious I got, until I finally figured out what was bothering me so much. The way he was moving and running was way too fast. It's not that Joshua couldn't run, but there was something regarding the sound and speed of that strange skittering that didn't seem human to me in the least. No matter how hard I tried, it was impossible for me to imagine that an actual person was making that noise somewhere behind me. I then considered the possibility that a stray dog had wandered into the room. A dog that's chasing some rats, I thought. That would perhaps explain what was going on. Except that the more I thought about it, it really didn't. For one, this dog never appeared anywhere in my line of sight, which I found rather odd and suspicious. And besides its speed, there had been no other signs that this could in fact be a dog. No barking, no panting, no sniffing. Nothing, except for that constant skittering, kicking dirt and cans wherever it went. And by the sound of it, it was far too big to be a rat as well. I can't say I was much of an animal enthusiast, but for a minute or so, I really tried my best to think of what might have been in there with me. Maybe Joshua had brought with him some weird animal he was keeping on a leash. That would explain why it remained out of my sight. And yet, considering how erratic it seemed to be behaving, you'd expect the person in charge of it to voice some kind of command at some point. But that didn't happen either. The whole thing only got stranger the more I tried to make sense of it. What exactly was he doing? And how was he doing it? Was he trying to screw with me in a weird way? Not actually trying to scare me, but rather simply force me to turn my head and have a look. Whoever or whatever was in the room with me suddenly took off once more at full speed, heading straight towards me this time, until it abruptly stopped right behind my chair, somehow being careful enough to not even touch it, regardless of its absurd velocity. I felt the dirt kicking into my ankles as a cloud of dust rose in the air around me due to the thing's momentum. And let me tell you, the way the air blew past me and ruffled my hair and clothes, it instantly took me back to those ice bucket challenge days, because it felt like one had been dumped all over me. Not just because the air carried a hint of something revolting and foul within, but there was also the implication regarding the size of whatever was now only mere inches away from me. Judging by how strong the wind seemed to blow when it finally stopped running, it had to be big. Only then did I start to consider the possibility that Joshua might not be responsible for any of it. And if that was the case, it meant I had absolutely no clue regarding what was in there with me and what their intentions were, if they had any to begin with. I thought about looking, which was a natural response to have when faced with the unknown. But this unmistakable gut feeling, the kind that's impossible to shrug off, helped me fight back the urge. My brain, on the other hand, was trying to come up with an explanation for what was happening, in a subconscious effort to disprove my growing worries. What if it was Joshua after all? What if it was nothing but a magnificent trick, expertly put together with all kinds of props I'd somehow missed on my way in? I was so convinced that I was going to win, that my own arrogance might have blinded me to that extent. Maybe Joshua was really putting on a Wizard of Oz kind of show, pulling the strings as he laughed from somewhere behind the scenes. And if that was the case, if there was even a small possibility of that being the actual truth, then I just had to be a trooper and endure it. There was no way I would lose to him, especially not against some cheap parlor tricks. I refused losing in such a disgraceful way. I felt like my whole body and brain were on fire, considering how much thinking I was doing, going over and over countless scenarios as I tried to figure out what was going on. I could tell I was getting all sweaty from it, and being in an empty, abandoned building in the early hours of the morning certainly didn't help, as the cold air kept giving me chills every now and then. But after a few minutes of feeling unusually warm and then very cold right afterwards, I realized what was actually happening. And if I wasn't already doing my absolute best not to move, this sudden realization definitely had me petrified. Something was blowing warm, moist air on the back of my neck. That was the source of the warmth I'd been feeling for a while, followed by chills as my skin then immediately readjusted to the cold temperature of the room. I was overcome with a sudden urge to look behind me, but I also had this ominous feeling that I would be committing a terrible mistake if I did. And of course, thoughts of actually breaking the rules and losing to Joshua kept picking away at my brain as well. In hindsight, that internal struggle was without a doubt instrumental in keeping me alive, as it prevented me from doing anything rash. Around 4:02 AM, the warm air began to increase, not only in intensity, but in quantity as well. It was no longer blowing on just the base of my skull or my hair. I could feel it now, warming up my entire body, which was a very distressing sensation, seeing as I still didn't know where it was coming from. A profoundly rotten stench also came along with it, which I'd caught merely a whiff of a few minutes earlier. No words can describe how vile and wrong that air smelled like. Even to this day, I've yet to encounter anything horrible and disgusting enough to compare to it. I only remember my immediate reaction to it and how it made me feel. It wasn't just extremely nauseating, but it was also very wrong on so many levels to be in its presence and breathing it in, almost as if I was committing an unspeakable crime simply by being there and becoming aware of it. It made me feel like I was in the presence of something that shouldn't be there, something that wasn't meant to be looked upon or even acknowledged in any way. It was impossible to imagine what sort of thing could be responsible for that otherworldly stench, and I feared I'd lose my mind in the pointless attempt to picture it in my head. But that vile air only gave further credibility to the reality I'd been trying to avoid. That there definitely had to be a mouth of some kind right behind me. And for it to be able to blow that amount of air in any single increment over such a wide angle. It couldn't just be any mouth. It had to be an impossibly large one. I didn't want to believe it. The idea that there was a giant mouth behind my back was ridiculous. I truly, desperately wanted to turn around and be proven wrong upon realizing the reasonable explanation for the source of it all. I only had to turn my head a little and to the side and finally see it with my own eyes. And yet, I did not look. Because, as much as the whole thing was starting to get to me, the very deliberate act of looking behind me would mean I was willingly giving up. And I wasn't ready to accept that. Even when nearly everything about what was going on made it abundantly clear that something truly sinister was afoot, and that I had absolutely no connection whatsoever to Joshua or the challenge, I still wanted to believe that was wrong. I had to believe that Joshua was behind everything, and that it was all going according to his plan. Otherwise, I would be forced to accept the terrifying reality where I was sharing the space with something both unexplainable and unnatural. And then, almost as if to intentionally confirm my worst suspicions, I heard a sound coming from right behind me. It sounded so close to me that I even felt its vibrations bounce off the back of my neck, which sent a terrible chill down my spine. It was a soft, dry clack, the sound your teeth make when you close your mouth with nothing in it, as if you were biting or chewing the air. And yet, despite it being clearly the sound of teeth knocking against each other, I still couldn't imagine a person or any kind of animal being responsible for it, almost as if there was nothing but teeth behind me. It kept repeating itself every few seconds. Although I didn't hear or make out anything else, there was something about that regular, almost playful clacking of teeth that seemed to be telling me, I want to sink my teeth into your flesh. I also noticed that the clacking had been steadily growing louder and stronger with every new clack, the reverberation now resulting in a tingling sensation that travelled across my entire body. And the louder it got, the bigger the image I had of those teeth seemed to grow in my mind. I didn't know what to do or how to react, but I knew that it was only going to get worse from that point onwards, and that the time had come for me to make a choice. I could either stay and take my chances, believe against all reason and common sense that it was truly the work of Joshua, or I could get the hell out of there as if my life depended on it, but risk losing the challenge I'd worked so hard to win if I happened to be overthinking everything. The unseen teeth were now loud enough that I could feel the ground and dirt rumble right under my feet. Everything around me seemed to shake whenever that mouth bit into the air at my back, and if it kept going like that, I was certain that the ever-growing and unstoppable reverberation would soon cause the building to collapse. The time was 4:22 a.m., so close to the end of the trial, with barely 8 minutes left on the clock. But by then, I had already made my mind up. I had to leave the place, and I had to do it fast. Even though I was no longer concerned with the trial or any of the rules, I decided that there wasn't a good enough reason for me to look at it. I didn't want to know what exactly I'd been sharing the room with all that time, especially when I'd pretty much accepted the fact that I had to be within reach of some monstrous entity. It was my belief that if I were to look at it, the mere sight of it would more than likely be enough to annihilate me mentally and prevent me from leaving. Exiting the way I came in wasn't an option. As far as I was concerned, the world behind me as I knew it was no longer there. The sound they were making was getting so unbearably loud that I couldn't imagine there being anything else except teeth and darkness lying in wait for me. The only way out of the room was through the window in front of me, the one on the leftmost side of the wall that appeared to be busted enough for me to fit through it. I needed to make a beeline for it if I wanted to get out as fast as possible, which meant I would have to leave my camera behind. Throwing the camera out of the window might have been an option, but there was no way for me to know what would happen from the moment I got off the chair. With that in mind, I simply didn't want to waste what could turn out to be precious time. Besides, there was absolutely no way for my camera to survive that fall. Leaving it behind meant that there was still a small chance of recovering it later, maybe. I tried picturing my escape. How many seconds and steps it would take for me to reach the window, and whether I wasn't underestimating the fall I'd have to take. But the clacking had become so deafeningly loud that I was barely able to hear myself think. Each new thunderous clack made my entire body go numb to the point where I wasn't feeling a thing anymore. That's when I noticed that my vision was gradually turning dark. I can't say for sure whether it was that sound making me lose consciousness, or if the thing had started to expand and swallow the remaining half of the room. But before I could tell exactly what was happening, I was already running. I want to say I felt something massive shuffling behind me as I made my escape, but it's best to take it all with a grain of salt, considering the state I was in. I also heard a crashing sound and saw what appeared to be pieces of wood splintering not too far away from me, and I could feel what might have been my chair that was sent flying. What happened next is still mostly a blur, which I'm quite thankful of, but I know I ended up rolling sideways out of the window before landing outside on top of some dead bushes and old pieces of wet and mouldy drywall. I landed on my left side, which resulted in my elbow pushing into my ribs and the impact immediately knocking the wind out of me. If you've had that happen to you at any point, you know how terrifying it can be, struggling to breathe yet not being able to no matter how hard you try. Eventually, I found myself on my back and breathing normally again, facing the night sky. I could feel the breeze and hear what little commotion there was on the streets, like the odd car driving by or a couple of joggers in their night run. I was hurting quite a bit, but I was back in the real world, surrounded by normal sights and normal sounds, which was all that mattered. As I lay there and realized I had just jumped out of a window, I started laughing at myself, feeling like a complete idiot. I took out my phone. 4:28 AM. I had lost the challenge, I thought, and in my humiliating defeat, I decided to stay put and wait for Joshua to come out and claim his victory. But he never showed up. I gave him a call when I finally managed to stand on my feet, but it went straight to voicemail. I slowly made my way around the building towards the main entrance, but found no one there waiting for me with a "gotcha" look on their face. I was still somewhat shaken by the fall, and as a result, I wasn't thinking straight. I thought about entering the building again, hoping that I could somehow retrieve my stuff, but I put that time to good use as I tried calling and texting Joshua repeatedly along the way. He eventually texted me back once through another phone number, saying that there had been a family emergency and that he would tell me the details the following day at the latest. While I didn't quite believe him straight away, I still had the common sense not to risk saying something that might have been seen as insensitive. My brain was pretty much fried by the time I got home, so I put my phone away, went straight to bed, and let my pain and exhaustion take over before quickly falling asleep. We talked over the phone later the next day, And to sum it up, he was indeed telling the truth. His father suffered a workplace-related injury, which I verified with my own eyes some months later. But he was fine for the most part. It could have been a lot worse, according to what the hospital staff said. As for the trial and everything, he was the first to bring it up. "It sucks, but screw it. Rules are rules. Money is yours. You deserve it," he said. I could tell by his tone that he was being genuine, but I also detected a faint little hint of regret and disappointment, likely for not having an actual shot at winning. Either way, it was over now, and he no longer cared for it, which was understandable considering what he and his family had just been put through. He also told me that, on the night of the trial, he had come to the building with enough time to spare, but in the end, he only managed to place the chair in the room before he got the call from his mom. He then went straight back to his car and hit the road, with nothing but his father's health and safety on his mind. He said he instantly forgot about me and the trial, which I obviously could never blame him for. When he eventually remembered, his phone was already dead, as he had spent hours talking with his relatives who kept updating him on his father's situation. He only messaged me that one time shortly after he arrived at the hospital and asked his mom to use a phone. I won the challenge in the end, but it's not like I had any reason or anyone to celebrate with. I didn't feel like a winner, and even if I did, it would be wrong for me to boast about it given the circumstances surrounding my victory. The prize money was nice, but I ended up having to spend it on a new camera. It was a good enough upgrade, I guess, but that's not how I intended to spend it initially. Needless to say, I never stepped inside that old building ever again. My friends thought it was weird of me, since I'd always liked the place so damn much. But I made up some excuse, saying how I couldn't help but associate the building with the night Joshua's father nearly died. I don't know if they believed me or not, but they didn't insist on the matter. No one ever found my old camera either, or else they would have told me. As far as Joshua is concerned, because nobody else cared anymore by that point, he thinks I sat there on the night of the trial like an idiot for nearly 2 hours before heading home. I never bothered to tell him or anyone else what I think happened to me. It wasn't worth the trouble, and to be honest, I just wanted to forget everything about that night and pretend it never happened. Perhaps I'd simply imagined the entire ordeal with my overly active imagination. And for a while, the lies I told myself were enough to make me forget the incident. And then one day, the nightmares began. And while they never exactly plagued me on a daily basis, they were terrible enough that they would leave me reeling for the following days. Whether I was asleep or awake, I was never able to picture or recall anything related to them under any circumstances. The only thing I could feel that still lingered on after I woke up was my reaction to whatever I witnessed and experienced during my slumber. This unequivocal feeling of helplessness and absolute terror. For all I know, my own mind is responsible for blocking off and preventing me from seeing the actual contents of my nightmares, just to protect what little sanity I have left. But what terrifies me the most, and nearly drives me insane, is a certain sound that wakes me up every single day. I can hear it and feel it so clearly in the air of my own room, surrounded by that unforgettable rotten stench, and I know that they're there. Teeth in the dark, clacking and waiting for the inevitable moment where I reach for the light switch, a moment that always comes not because I'm brave, but because deep down I hope that whatever is in my room has finally grown tired of playing games with me and will put me out of my misery once and for all. And yet, every time the lights come on and I find myself alone, the clacking suddenly stops and the smell vanishes without leaving a trace, as if it were never there in the first place. But I know I'm not imagining it. The same thing will happen tomorrow, and likely the day after as well. They'll always be there, no matter where I go, and regardless of what I do, biding their time until I'm ripe for the taking. And when that day comes, I will turn on the lights and find it there, as it finally reveals its true and impossible form to me, because the sight of it destroys my mind, or its teeth tear me apart. Whichever comes first, I will kneel to it and welcome the end that is sure to follow. Only then will I find peace. Her body was delivered to the morgue late at night. Prior, my colleague had an emergency at home, so I was all alone when I received it. The guys who delivered the body winked at me and smiled. Have fun figuring this one out. So right away, even before opening the body bag, I knew I had an interesting case in my hands. I realized it was so when I looked at the paperwork. Even though I wasn't very active online and didn't pay attention to any trends, I instantly recognized the name. Elena Frolova, one of the most prominent online personas of Russia. Instagram model, beauty and travel vlogger, influencer, those were the labels associated with her. She was the girl all women under 40 wanted to be. Successful, beautiful, popular. She probably charged for one Instagram ad post more than I earned in 2 years, and many men would kill for a date with her. And now, she was all alone with me, dead at my table. I felt a tingle of excitement and intrigue. Maybe those aren't the feelings that people usually feel at the prospect of seeing a dead body, but I was a coroner. To me, she was nothing more than a clue I had to solve. Besides, it's not every day you get a chance to figure out the cause of death of such a prominent celebrity. In many ways, it was my way of getting closer to her, same as people feel closer to celebrities when they see them on the streets. I opened the bag with the same anticipation as the kid who unwraps his New Year gift. The first thing I noticed was that there was no smell. Either she didn't start decomposing yet, or... I looked inside and eyebrows disappeared behind my hair locks. It was not the face I expected to see. She looked like she had gained 30 years before her death, her face covered in numerous wrinkles. Her skin was also dried up, and her lips were so dry they cracked in a few places. Then it hit me. She didn't age. She was just severely dehydrated. To a point, her body was pretty much mummified. So, at first glance, it seemed pretty cut and dry. She died of dehydration. Only, how was that possible? How could her dehydration reach such a point that she became a mummy? Even if she wasn't drinking anything for 5 days, her body wouldn't be shriveled like that. No, it seemed like something drained most of her bodily fluids, or was kept in a stove for days. I had to keep looking. It was then that I noticed something poking from beneath her eyelids. Carefully lifting it up, I saw some thin object sticking out of a shriveled eye, right from the middle of it. The object was long and curved. I expected it to be maybe a few inches long, but it turned out to be almost a foot in length. No doubt it went through her head all the way to the back before colliding with the skull and bending downwards. When I had started pulling it, the end of it was probably reaching all the way down to her chest. The biggest surprise, however, was the nature of that object. I was surprised at first when I realized what it was, but there was no mistake about it. I'd been around enough body parts to know what I was looking at, no matter how impossibly big it was. A human nail. Long, uneven, trying to curl up into a spiral in my hands, with a hint of pinkish nail polish at the end. I'd seen a nail that long only once, when I was a kid, in a book of Guinness World Records. It belonged to an Indian man who had raised his hand and didn't lower it for 26 years. Over that time, his nails grew to be a meter long. But outside of that, never. Curious, I looked at her own hands and was surprised to see that all of her nails were at least 6 inches long, all curly and uneven, ending with fractures that seemed to indicate that they were even longer before the medical team brought her in. To grow the nails that long, she'd have to spend years not cutting them, and even more, the nails didn't seem to be taken care of. Not exactly how I imagined the nails of a popular beauty blogger. Maybe I was missing something about her. Luckily, I had an opportunity to take a look for myself. I took my smartphone, quickly installed Instagram, and, after a bit of searching, found her account. Her last post was 3 days ago. It was a picture of her nails. "Thank you at Kate Burdack for recommending me this wonderful balm for nail growth. It's already working, and my broken nails has already regrown in 1 day. My fashion week is going to be saved," was written under the photo. A few photos before that, there was a post with a pouty face. "Broke my nails, sad face. Just 5 days before the fashion week. Hashtag hardships of a beauty blogger." I was too tired to make sense of it. Plus, I felt dirty for spying on a dead person's private life, even if she was parading it for everyone to see. So I closed the app, closed the body bag, and loaded her into one of the free cells. I was going to figure it all out later, I told myself, and went back to watching the TV show on my laptop. A few hours later, I was distracted from it by the sound that all coroners fear to hear in a morgue. A scratching sound, coming from one of the cells, the one where Frolova's body was stored. At first, I froze in place. I remembered the scary stories that the students in medical university like to scare each other with. Stories about maniacs who were presumably killed only to come back to life at a morgue, or haunted experiences a friend's friend once had. But then I got a grip of myself. They were just bodies, nothing else. No matter how many times I'd cut them up, I didn't see a soul emerge from within. Such things weren't real. And if I were to give in to my fears even once, I'd be their victim forever. No, the best course of action was to face the fear head-on, to see there was nothing supernatural and shame your primal urges to run away from the unknown and unexplored. I opened Frolova's cell and rolled her out. The body bag's shape had changed, but I didn't pay attention to it, unzipping it open. Immediately, I leapt back in terror. It was one thing to tell yourself there was nothing scary in the shadows, but now, I was face to face with something that I couldn't rationalize. Fear left me with no place to fall back to. Nails. Nails everywhere, spinning into spirals, getting thicker and thinner along their length, piercing in and out of her flesh in their aimless and blind urge to grow. Her body had shriveled even more than before, her skin becoming so thin it looked like a layer of paper on top of her bones. I pulled at the edges of the body bag to take a look at her arms, noting how light her body had become, and surely enough, the nails were hers. They had continued to grow throughout the night, long after her body was dead, draining it of all the nutrients it required. The cause of death was now clear to me. Whatever nail growth balm she was recommended did its job, but I doubted that she was aware of the price. The moment she used it, she was doomed to see her nails grow uncontrollably, draining all strength from her, leaving her powerless to even call for help. I could almost see her, lying on the floor of her room, watching the cage of nails grow around her, fighting against it until she could cut them no more. The only thing I had yet to determine was, did she die before the nail pierced her eye and burrowed into her brain? Or after? In the mid-90s, I used to be a photo technician. Those were the days when all you could do on your phones was dial a number, and if you wanted to take photos, you brought a camera containing actual rolls of film that you had to drop off at the store to be developed. Amazing how times change. As far as jobs go, I couldn't complain. The pay and hours were solid, and I was pretty much my own boss. But there was one thing I never really got used to. Looking at the photos of complete strangers always felt slightly intrusive, even if they knew I was doing it. Spending hour after hour in an ominously lit dark room filled with chemicals so you could take a peek at the memories of people you had never even met is inherently voyeuristic. It's almost like going through someone's stuff. So that's why I always made sure not to get too interested in what photos I was developing. Some days I like to pretend I was in the government lab developing film for some kind of top secret project, but the reality was nowhere near that. Usually the most exciting pictures I dealt with were holiday pictures of parents wearing ugly Christmas sweaters before they were a joke. One day I was developing some photos of a drop-off order. I had done the initial process. I was now checking my work to make sure it had come out okay. Everything looked fine. The colours were all normal, and the images were just as they should be. Since this was back when someone could have red eyes in pictures, they weren't exactly the model of clarity and detail we have now, but they were acceptable. I was just about to put these away and start on my next order, when for some reason, one of the photos caught my attention. Most of these pictures were shot of the outdoors that someone took near a park or something. There were some beautiful shots of a lake filled in on every side by dense pine trees. It was gorgeous to look at, but there was something a little off. One of the last pictures showed a family of 5 gathered together in front of a cluster of blue spruce trees near a pond in the afternoon. In the left corner, near the edge of the shot, there was the shape of a person. There wasn't much you could tell, but it was definitely a person standing there, wearing what looked like a black shirt and blue jeans. It's clear from the picture that the photographer was either ignoring the person, or more likely, had no idea the person was even there. There was nothing obviously alarming about it, but it reminded me of those blurry Bigfoot pictures that were on the front page of some of the tabloids located out in front. It was something about the lone person lurking out in the woods that looked slightly creepy. But a random person making it into the shot happened in a ton of pictures, especially back then. So I finished the order, went on with the next batch, and forgot about the picture. About 3 weeks later, I was going through a totally different order when I found another strange picture. Except this one was different. Instead of the great outdoors, this picture was from a birthday party of some sort. In the picture I was looking at, everyone was inside a massive dining room and clustered around a big dining room table, while the birthday girl, a blonde girl who looked to be about 20, was blowing out the candles on her extravagant white birthday cake. But what caught my attention was the large bay window that everyone was facing away from. There was a man standing outside, closely watching everyone inside. He was average looking from what I could tell, But what caught my attention was his expression. He wasn't standing out there with a woeful expression that said he felt left out. No, this guy was intently watching them, like one watches an animal at the zoo. I wasn't 100% sure, but I thought that he may have been looking at whoever was taking the photo. Either way, I had no idea what to think. Was this a relative about to pull a prank on the birthday girl or something? I've seen plenty of awkward and downright weird family photos, but this one seemed different. I'd seen enough awkward family photos to know that you can recognize them almost immediately. They have a unique charm to them that gives you a good laugh, but in a heartwarming, "oh, my family is just like that" way. Since there wasn't much of anything I could do about a weird picture, I checked the rest of the pictures, packaged it up, and kept on with my work. But this time, I couldn't shake the image. Over a month later, there was another weird picture. The setting this time was some kind of pool party. From the looks of the flag-themed decor, it was some kind of 4th of July get-together. It looked like a fun time. Plenty of people waving sparklers and eating grilled hamburgers and hot dogs in between taking a dip in an in-ground swimming pool. As the day turned to nighttime, the pictures now showed people gathered around a large campfire where they roasted marshmallows. My stomach dropped when I saw someone in a picture who looked just like the guy from the birthday party picture. What gave him away was the same expression I'd seen before. Unflinching, unsmiling, and out of place amidst all the holiday festivities. This time, he was in the next to last photo. The picture was of a huge gathering at some public park, with all the people spread out on blankets and folding chairs. I figured everyone was there to see some fireworks. I didn't recognize the location or the other people in the shot, but there was no mistaking the man I saw peering at the group from far off in the background. Was this some kind of stalker or something? Because there was no way this was all a coincidence, especially because the orders were all placed under different names. The weird part was that the people in these pictures were completely different from the ones I had seen before. The only similarity I could tell, aside from the strange man, was that in both instances, he had only appeared when there was a photo of a large group of people. The old saying, "a picture says 1,000 words," is very true at times, but sometimes you wished they could say 1,000 more. I had no idea what the context was for the stranger in the picture. Worse, there was nothing I could really do. All I had was the name the respective orders was placed under, and that was it. Ignoring the chill that had just washed over me, I finished the order and went on to the next. I managed to forget about what I'd seen, until one night, about 2 months later. I was manning the customer service counter for the night, and was just getting ready to go on break when I heard the telltale bell clinging that meant we had a customer. Putting my stuff down, I strode to the front to take care of things. "How can I help you?" I asked of the customer, whose back was turned to me. "Hi, I have an order to pick up. I believe my wife placed it under the name Crawford." He turned to face me, and my stomach dropped to somewhere around my knees. It was the strange man from the pictures. Same closely cropped hair, an unreadable expression. Of course," I managed to say while checking the cartons of packages ready to pick up. Crawford was mercifully near the top. I wasted no time in grabbing it and returning to face the guy. "Here you are. That'll be $7.95. "Here you are." He gave me a 10, and I quickly made change. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" I asked over the deafening sound of my own heart rate. "Oh no, thank you. This is plenty. Between the two of us, I'm just happy to finally get some time off work. I'm in law enforcement, so my schedule is a mess," he added while showing the legit badge and ID on the inside of his wallet. No kidding. Yep, I've been doing undercover work for the last few months, and it's finally over. That's why I'm thrilled to be doing something as ordinary as run errands. You should be able to read all about it in the paper tomorrow. But there was this serial killer operating around here. His victims were all people he knew personally. He would go to their houses for holidays and stuff, and they never suspected a thing. I'll give him this. He was clever. Since he never wanted to have his picture taken there, he would instead volunteer to be the one to take the big family photos of everyone. I even watched him do it a few times myself. Scary stuff, huh? Very, I agreed, as relief began flooding through my body. It's easy to forget a photo shows everything, except the person taking it. Sometimes nostalgic things are best left forgotten. Tuesday was computer lab day, the best day of the week. Mrs. Henson's 4th grade class would line up, single file, and march down to the end of the hallway. We would shuffle into the computer classroom and take our seats at the colourful Macs. Typically, we would spend the first half of class learning the names of hardware parts, followed by an educational spelling or math game. There were rare occasions where we had the entire hour to ourselves, free to play the games we wanted. Most of my classmates spent their time traversing the Oregon Trail, rolling around in Bugdom, or racing cars in Cavemen. The game I played was not very popular. In fact, I think I was the only one who played it, mainly because it was incredibly simple and somewhat childish, as if 4th graders had the right to call anything childish. It was called Shop Till You Drop. The whole premise was to go through different stores in a shopping mall and collect the little trinkets before the mannequins caught you. It was set in the first person, and your score would increase as you picked up teddy bears, clothing items, shoes, etc., all worth varying amounts of points. The mannequins all stood in silly poses, like a ballerina dancer or a guy flexing. They would slowly move towards you if you spent too long in a store, and you would have to maneuver around them to reach items worth more points. The goal was to get to the mall entrance with at least 1,000 points and not have any of the mannequins touch you. I never got to the end. As easy as it was to get the points, I was always caught making a break for the door. Every time I would hold down the R key to run for the entrance, and a mannequin would come out of nowhere and block my way. It was always the same one, a male figure in a black suit, tipping his top hat towards me. His other hand outstretched, palm face up, and he was bent over in a graceful bow. No matter which route I took, the suit would pop up in my path, and I would be forced to start over. Despite my frustrations with the game, I played it every chance I could. I even had it installed at home. Every day after school, I would get off the bus and race to our desktop, eager to get in a few tries before dinner time. I double-clicked on the purple shopping bag icon labelled Stud, and the welcome screen appeared. One day, however, something was slightly off. Instead of the normal screen that said Play in big yellow letters, there was a text box that prompted me to enter my name. I did so without hesitation, thinking it was some new feature that had been added. The screen faded to black and then opened in the mall as usual. Only this time, all the stores were closed. Every entrance was barricaded by one of those metal gates that closes down like a garage door. I was facing the escalators, which were always roped off to give the illusion that there was a second floor without actually having any content that existed there. This time, the escalators were running. Again, I was assuming some new version of the game had been released. I moved the character forward and began the ascent to the second floor of the mall. As I reached the top, I noticed that there weren't any shops on either side of the floor. The walls were completely bare, stretching on forever in both directions. I started walking for a while and found it incredibly boring. there was literally nothing. It got to the point where I could not see an end behind or in front of me. Even when I tried to turn around and retrace my steps, the escalator was nowhere to be found. I was trapped in this never-ending hallway. I closed out of the game and decided I would look it up on Google later. I was probably doing something wrong. Maybe the second floor had an exit where I could finally get past the man in the suit. On the next lab day at school, I decided to test a different approach. As soon as I clicked on the icon, I received a message saying, "Welcome back, Josh." I stared at the screen for a minute and wondered how it possibly could know my name. I was only 9, but old enough to know that my home and school computers were not connected, and I had not created any kind of account for it to remember my name. As strange as this was, I forgot about it in about 5 seconds because I began the game in an entirely new area. This time, I was in some kind of storage room. I could tell by the boxes piled up everywhere. They were overflowing with merchandise, all kinds of toys and apparel, everything I had to collect in the game. There must have been 10,000 points right in front of me, 100,000 even. I was ecstatic. I could satisfy my score immediately and focus my attention on finding the exit. I did not know if there was a point to scoring above 1,000, but I sure did love to see the numbers go up. I moved the character around the room, clicking the mouse on every box to find the contents inside. The room seemed like it was never ending. My score had skyrocketed to over 500,000 points before I noticed the first mannequin. It was facing away from me. Well, its body was anyway. The head was turned around slightly, and it had a hand in front of its lips, almost in a shh fashion. I tried to avoid the mannequin at all costs, not wanting to lose my record score, not knowing if the next time I played I would be in this room. However, it got to the point where its location was my only way forward. I started moving closer, and then I heard a sound that gave me goosebumps. It was the sound of someone saying, "Shh," very forcefully, as if the consequences of making any kind of noise were strictly forbidden. Let me explain that it was against computer lab rules to have the volume on. We would get in trouble if there were any sounds turned on in the games. I will swear on my mother's grave that my computer was on mute that day. The sound was loud. It was loud enough that anyone in the lab should have heard it. But all of my classmates continued their games like nothing had happened. The teacher did not even look up from her desk. I inched the character closer to the mannequin, and it suddenly whipped around at lightning speed, its whole body spinning like a top and facing me. The hand was still pressed to its mouth. Then I heard a great, booming voice that echoed off the classroom walls. "What did I tell you, Josh?" it shouted. I flinched. "Do you want to wake them up?" I immediately closed out of the game and pushed my chair away from the computer. Nobody around me seemed fazed by my reaction. I was terrified. I went home and went straight to my room, not bothering to even try the game again. I could not understand why I heard what I did, and for everyone else not to hear the loud mannequin yell. I was both scared that this cartoonish game had turned dark, but also frustrated that I'd lost such a high score and made no progress at finding the exit. I did not play stud for several weeks. On computer lab day, I opted for number crunches. I was nervous to try the game again, not knowing what I would find or what other scary things were in there. About a month later, I decided to suck it up and try it again. When I clicked the icon, another text box came up and read, "Welcome back, Josh. Where have you been?" I read the words for several minutes, trying to process how it still remembered me, and how it had a concept of my absence. I decided to ignore it, and I clicked play. I regret that decision to this very day. I began the game as normal. I was in the middle of the mall, surrounded by open shops on either side. I could see the collectibles floating and spinning across the floor, and the usual amount of silly mannequins patrolling around. I started picking up the items, doing my typical pattern of avoiding the outstretched arms and jumping over counters to access the higher scoring trinkets. Everything was going according to plan, until I left my last shop with 1,000 points and started towards the exit. The mannequin in the suit was already there. It had its arms crossed, or as best the mannequin could cross its arms. They were overlapped and stiff in an unusual way. There were no signs of a silly pose, or any indication that its appearance was friendly, as the game always was. The top hat was pulled down slightly over where its eyes would be, and I could make out the plastic shape of the mouth that had been curved into a frown. Then, it spoke to me. The voice was nowhere near as loud as the mannequin in the storage room. It was calm, almost soothing, but there was a tinge of disappointment in its tone. I began to feel scolded, as a parent would when they tried to give a light-hearted lecture. "Josh, you didn't go upstairs, did you?" I froze. My eyes flashed to the top of the escalator. I could make out the top of a mannequin's head overlooking the rail. Its plastic skull was all that was visible, peering down to me. Then I saw another, then another. There must have been hundreds of them, thousands, just the tops of their heads looking down at me in the mall, like spectators at a stadium. I looked back at the suit and realized that it was slightly closer to me. "You woke them up, you little turd. You went upstairs. They heard your little feet stomping around. Then you were snooping around the storage area. You were told to be quiet, and you didn't listen." The mannequins on the second floor began to pour over the railings. The lifeless bodies rained down from above, piling up around me, landing in the fountain, crashing through the shop windows and shattering upon the ground. The sound was deafening. It sounded like the worst hailstorm ever. A pounding, thunderous noise. I looked around at the class, and no one had reacted. They were glued to their screens. I looked back at my own screen, and the suit was now inches from my character's point of view. Its plastic face was gleaming. It burned like the sun in front of me. And then, I looked at its mouth. The frown it had before was replaced with a terrible, black void. Rows of razor-sharp teeth engulfed the screen. And then, there was darkness. The game crashed. My computer screen went black. I faked a stomachache and was sent home. Several months went by. I finished the 4th grade and began a normal summer, spending most of my time outside and away from any electronics. Somehow, the game left my mind, a distant memory that faded into nothingness. Through my 5th grade year, I played Oregon Trail and Bugdom like everyone else. Into middle school, I started getting into Minecraft, then eventually Call of Duty, and then the Fortnite craze. A few months ago, I got an email from one of my childhood friends. It was an invite to our 10th high school reunion. I RSVP'd and attended the get-together last night. It started out awkward. Old friends trying to make small talk and former relationships introducing spouses to each other. After a couple hours, and a lot of alcohol, everyone started to relax. A group of us took a bottle of wine and found a spot away from the party. We started sharing stories of our lives, and eventually started reminiscing about school. "Remember Oregon Trail?" Dave blurted out. "You have died of dysentery," he mocked. Everyone laughed and started throwing in phrases from the game. It was very nostalgic. It was overpowering. It made me remember. When it was quiet a little later, I chimed in with my own memory. Hey, anyone remember Shop Till You Drop? That old Moore game with the mannequins? I asked. Everyone looked at me, puzzled. They shook their heads. You walk around collecting stuff? I added. No one seemed to remember. I explained more about the game, and not a single person recognized it. I pulled out my phone and searched the title, but there were 0 results. It was like it never existed. I think you've had one too many, bud, Dave said. We got up and made our way back to the party. I immediately noticed that the music had stopped. In fact, I couldn't hear anything. No voices, no laughs. I looked around. Instead of my high school class dancing and having fun, I saw hundreds of mannequins. Every single one of them was facing away from me. I turned to my group of friends, and they too were now lifeless statues. They were also not facing me, their clothes and appearances the same, but now stiff plastic instead of flesh. I started shaking in terror. A cold sweat broke out, and I felt every hair on my body stand on end. In the middle of the sea of mannequins, there was one facing the wrong direction. It had on a top hat. Its mouth was pulled downward into a frown. I could see its arm raised slightly above its head. A clenched fist instead of a thumb stuck out, pointing towards me. I looked into the direction of the thumb and saw a neon green exit sign above the door to the building's entrance. I looked back at the suit. You never came back, Josh, it croaked, the voice of a tired old man. I took a step backward. Don't you run. They'll get you. They always get you. I looked at my group of friends, and they were a little closer to me, their plastic arms slightly raised. It's time to go shopping, Josh. At once, the mannequins disappeared. The room was replaced by a mall food court. I was in the middle of rows of tables, looking out into an empty shopping area where little trinkets floated above the ground. In the distance, I saw the same green exit sign. My phone battery is at 7%. I've collected over 1,000 points. I need to get to the exit, but I can feel them watching me. I can feel him watching me. I need someone to remember. Please, does anyone remember Stud? How do I win? How do I get out of here? Please. At approximately 3:37 EST this morning, something the size of an Airbus Atlas passed through the Great Lakes waterway. It must have come in from the Atlantic, navigated its way through the natural channels and man-made locks that make up the St. Lawrence Seaway. I was working up top when I first heard about it. It was Billings, the poor bugger. At first, I thought he was messing with me, getting me back for the prank I pulled a month or so ago. But when he finally clicked off the radio and stomped up and over to where I was sitting so he could talk to me face to face, I realized he wasn't messing with me at all. He looked scared, terrified even. This wasn't normal for Bill. So, I said, leaning back in my chair and grinning, you saw a thing? He nodded, his face earnest. And what exactly is this thing? It was big, he said, waving his arms around wildly. Too big, like the size of a damn plane. A plane? A cargo plane, one of those ones that the military uses. That makes no sense, I said. It wouldn't fit. That's what she said, Billings said, pitifully, letting out one sharp bark of nervous laughter. It rang flat around the room we were in. I sighed, then said, "All right, let's go check." "Really?" he said. He sounded semi-hopeful, but still scared. "Really, come on." He watched as I stood up and stretched, then followed me over to the room where we kept the radar and CCTV monitors. "So," I said, "where do you see it?" "Just as it appeared in the lock, about 5 minutes ago." "All right, let's see." I sat down in front of the monitors, rewound the tape, and pressed play. "Bill," I said, turning back in my seat to look at his face. "There's nothing here." "Nothing?" "Nothing. Take a look for yourself." Bill maneuvered around me, then whined in fear. "It's there, man," he said. "Right there. What the hell even is that?" "Where?" I asked. "I don't see anything. Are you messing with me? I have to say, this is one of your weaker efforts, Billings." I ran a hand through my unkempt hair. "Look, I have to get back to work." But Bill didn't let up. He leaned around me, rewound the tape again and pressed play, then repeated the process 2 more times. "Bill," I said, "come on, stop." "Look, it's right there. Can't you see it? It just bloody appears, man, out of nowhere." I blew some air out of my nose, looking at him with a sort of sympathy. Maybe the guy was working too hard. Maybe he was starting to snap. "Okay," I said, "I'll humor you." I swiveled back around in my chair and leaned in closer to the screen. And there, just there, right underneath the water's surface, I saw it. A glimmer. It was faint, nearly invisible, but there it was. There was something about it, how it caught the barely visible light, how the water moved around it, something strange and sinister. "Weird," I said. Billings perked up. "You see it?" "I mean, could be a school of fish, caught up in the lock or something." "Man," Bill said, "I've been working here for 9 years, and I ain't never seen anything like that before." "Huh," I said, then rolled myself over to the second set of monitors where the radar was. "Well, damn." "What?" Bill quickly hobbled over to where I was and looked down. "What the hell?" "Yeah, well, that's weird." The radar showed something big, just like Bill said. It was slowly inching down the waterway, morphing to fit through it. I switched to real time and saw this thing, whatever it was nearly out of the second lock, which was bizarre because we hadn't lowered the water or the gate. It was just disappearing, slowly but surely. I stood up, fast, then made my way back towards the monitor's room's only doorway. "Hey, where are you going?" Bill called out. "Angers," I said. "I'm going to go check with Angers, over on the other side. My radio's upstairs, hang tight." I left Bill standing there, watching me walk away with a freaked out expression on his face, and made my way back up top. My radio was on the table where I'd left it, sitting next to my phone. I picked it up and pinged Angers. Angers picked up immediately. "Yeah?" he said. He sounded worried. "Hey Angers, we're getting some real weird footage over here. I was wondering if you..." "It's nothing," Angers said, his voice coming in staticky over the radio. "What?" I said, "No, everything looks fine over here." "You sure, man? You looking at your radar?" "Yeah, kid, I'm sure. It's nothing. And if anyone asks you about it, you didn't see anything." "Wait," I said. "What do you mean if anyone asks me about it?" Angus didn't respond. Hey Angus, what did you mean if anyone asks me about it? But Angus had turned his radio off. I set my radio back down and said, Damn. I left the room and walked back down to where the radar and CCTV monitors were. Hey Bill, you're never going to believe this. I think we might have a regular conspiracy. I stopped and looked around. Bill? I turned back towards the door I'd just entered. Hey, Billings, where are you, buddy? Bill? Bill didn't answer. What the hell? I mumbled to myself, then left the monitor room to look for Bill. But Bill wasn't anywhere in the building, which meant there was only one place he could be. Outside. Oh, for goodness sake, I said, then ran back upstairs to grab my coat. Billings was standing just at the edge of the lock, looking down. Above us, clouds skirted across the sky, obscuring stars every now and then. Bill? Bill? Hey Bill, what the hell are you doing, man? Bill turned to me and pointed. It's still here, he yelled. What? Really? He nodded, then turned back around and looked back down. Bill, come on, man. We should call this in. Angus said he didn't see anything, but then he said something weird, man. And I don't know. My voice trailed off as I stood there, watching Bill from a distance of a dozen feet or so. Bill? Without warning, Bill jumped. It took me a second to realize what had happened. A stream of several, oh God, swept out of my mouth as I ran forward to the edge of the lock. But Billings had disappeared. There wasn't even a ripple showing where he hit the water. I shoved my hands into all my pockets before I realized I left both my phone and radio back inside on the second floor of the building. Damn it, I yelled, then sprinted back inside for my phone. It rang twice before a voice said, We're sorry, the number you have dialed... Are you kidding me right now? It was a staticky growl and I picked up the radio. Angus, it's Bill. He jumped into the damn lock, man. He's going to freeze to death or drown. Angus, come on, man. If you can hear this, call 911. My phone isn't working. The static grew louder, higher in pitch. Then I heard Angus say, Yeah, I hear you. Don't worry, they're already on the way. Oh, thank God, I said. Thanks, But Angus cut me off. Don't tell them anything, okay? This isn't the first time. Billings was suicidal, okay? You're a good kid. I don't want you to... The radio cut dead. 30 minutes later, a fire truck, followed by a sleek black SUV, pulled up. The firemen fished Billings out of the water, while two suits surveyed the area. One of them, with salt and pepper grey hair and mean eyes, stepped over to me and said, Sir, we'd like to ask you a few questions. He jumped, man. I didn't do anything. Yes, the other man, bald with a beard, said. I'm sure we'll be able to see. He gestured toward the CCTV camera that was hanging off the building. Sir, did you see anything strange tonight? I hesitated for a split second. You mean stranger than my co-worker jumping to his death? Neither of the men's poker faces fell. Yes, the greying one said. No, I didn't. Do you mind if we take a look inside? Maybe view the footage from the lock? What's that got to do with Billings drowning? We can get a warrant if necessary. I mean, I just work here. You should call the boss and ask him. Look, I'm cold as hell. My co-worker I've known for 3 years just died. Can I go home now? Maybe answer your questions later today. The two men seemed to think about this. Fine, the bald one said, then reached forward and handed me an off-white business card. Thanks, man. Wait, one of the men called out from behind me. I turned. You said your coworker jumped. Was he suicidal by any chance? Uh, I said. I mean, he joked about it sometimes, but I never really thought he'd do something like. I never thought he'd actually do anything, you know? The man stared at me with an unreadable expression, then said, "All right, we'll talk to you soon." I left the area with no problem. I didn't really want to see Billings like that. I drove, went to bed, then woke up hours later and recorded this, just in case. I don't know what the hell happened, or what Billings saw down there. I realize now that those two suits probably confiscated all the tapes on the premises. But the strangest thing is, I can't get in touch with Angers, and I don't know what to do. In my first year of junior college, I picked up a part-time job at a local self-storage facility. If you've never been to one, it's basically a cluster of metal storage units arranged in grids, where people keep their extra furniture. I manned the front desk in the evenings, often with a female student named Liz. Most nights were lethally boring. Liz and I would sit around doing homework and exchanging stories about our lives, occasionally buzzing a car into the lot or helping a renter with a stuck lock. Our manager came in only once a week and hated working there even more than we did. His name was Stefan, and his Polish accent was so thick we almost nodded our way through conversations with him. A few times a month, he'd bring his ancient golden retriever, Leo, who loved laying in my shoes while I sat at the desk. Those were my favourite nights at work. Stefan expected me to walk the facility each night, checking for unfastened locks, spills, weird noises and smells, or anything else out of order. He'd always say, "You a man, you go. Liz stay. Liz no go in dark." I understood his concern. Every few months the cops would show up and we'd be forced to open a unit. Invariably, there was a low-budget meth lab inside, or otherwise some kind of redneck pharmacy whose contents would land a man in the clink for a decade. "Chemicals," Stefan would say. "You smell, you call." He was a decent guy, but he didn't like Leo much. The dog belonged to his late wife, and Stefan made it very clear that he'd gotten stuck with him when she died. Leo got most of his affection from us, and we didn't mind one bit. Aside from the rules and babysitting his dog, Stefan rarely bugged me. But he'd chat with Liz on his way out of the office each night. "Maybe you'll teach me science," he'd joke. "Get us both bigger money." He obviously thought she was cute, and I couldn't blame him. What Stefan didn't know was that Liz was a shameless kleptomaniac who would sometimes pilfer his office for the master key. After a few drug dens were uncovered on the premises, the cops made us switch to company-issued locks that could be opened on short notice. There was a lot of legal grey area around this, so Stefan never let us use it. But the police ordered that the key remain on site in the event Stefan wasn't around and they needed to get into someone's unit. The job got a lot more interesting the first time Liz showed me the key. On dead nights, when no renters came in for hours, she and I would open a few units and peek inside. Sometimes we'd make a game of it. We'd read the owner's application, which listed their name, age and profession, and then we'd try to guess what kind of crap they stored in a dump like this. Liz and I worked that building like professional cons. We'd pick a floor and a corridor and try to finish up a couple of units in the 15 minutes that we dared to be away from the desk. The best part was watching Leo snoop around and bark excitedly when he got too riled up. We always let him lead the way. Stefan was none the wiser. More than half of the security cameras in the building were long dead, and the other half were almost never recording. Stefan never bothered to replace the old tapes. 90% of the units we cracked had furniture and clothes, We'd call these duds, because there was never anything interesting in them. But the others had valuable sports memorabilia or collector's items. On principle, I never allowed Liz to take anything, and she came to respect my rule. After all, it would be both our asses if something went missing. In a few months, we'd covered only 3 floors in the 5-story building. We found all kinds of interesting things, both great and terrible. One guy, I'll call him Joe, kept a meticulously arranged gay porn shrine made entirely of cutouts from adult magazines from the 1970s. Perhaps this wasn't so interesting on its own, but the fact that Joe was the arch-conservative reverend of our town's biggest church made it a pretty spicy meatball. On another occasion, we found a mostly empty unit, spare a filthy, sheetless mattress in the center and an old video camera facing it. Liz had told me about the people trying to use storage facilities as a place to sell sex, but just the look of this one made me feel like something else was up. It took days of careful watching, but eventually, we noticed that the unit's owner, one Mr. Klein, was driving in with a teenage girl crouched in his backseat, and not the kind on the legal side of 18. That was the day we decided to make sure the cameras were on in his corridor. We told Stefan, and he said he'd take care of it. The unit was cleared out the next time I came in. One day, Liz called me on my night off. I was surprised to hear from her. We weren't the sort of friends who talked outside of work. "Can you come visit me? I really don't want to be alone here right now." The urgency in her voice conjured 1,000 dark scenarios in my head. I imagined a male renter cornering her alone in that dim and dingy office. I even thought of Stefan going in for a kiss or something creepy like that. "What's going on? Are you alright?" I heard the click of a lock. "Just get here." I just finished one of my night class. Self-store was on the way home. "I'll be there in 10. When I arrived, I found Liz standing in the corner of the office, clutching a coffee mug with both hands like she was about to throw it on the next person she saw. It took her a minute to recognize me through the glass, but then she let me in, and explained that she'd gotten so bored, she'd decided to go exploring. "Liz, we agreed to never do that alone," I said. "That's part of the rule." I put my school sweatshirt around her in a lame attempt to comfort her. I didn't know what else to do. Liz pulled the sweatshirt tighter around herself, and then nodded at the key on the desk. I scooped it up and glanced at the computer screen. Unit D16's profile was open. It belonged to a Clara Norbach. I looked back to Liz, whose gaze seemed to pierce through the floor. "Okay," I said, heading out the door. "I'll be right back." I'd never cracked a unit on the 4th floor. Liz had decided to make a go of it without me. I knew exactly where the unit was, because the layout was the same on each level. But this floor was darker. Fewer people rented up here, and some of the overhead lights hadn't had their bulbs replaced in years. A faint but unmistakable odor reached my nose as I made my way down the hall. It was sickly sweet, like the stink of rotting meat. The closer I drew, the stronger it got. When I lifted the sliding metal door into the unit, a wave of stench nearly blasted me off my feet. Before me lay a large wooden table, and behind it, a bookshelf-turned altar. Dried blood caked the surface of the table and snaked down its legs to the cement floor. A dozen half-burned candles adorned the altar, ceremoniously arranged beneath a painting I couldn't make out. I covered my nose with my shirt and flicked on the light switch, but the bulb had been removed. I used my cell phone to illuminate the room, and suddenly, a few objects glinted and glittered around me. On the table was a cleaver, thick and fit for butchering. Resting on the altar between the candles was a particularly cruel-looking boning knife. I approached the painting, and on the way, my shoe squished against a hunk of gore. I yelped as my foot slid away from me, but I caught myself on the altar. Bits of hair-covered meat lay strewn across the floor, and a mass of viscera lay piled up at the far end of the room. I looked up and beheld the painting that now loomed over me. It depicted the shape of a man shrouded in darkness, his hands clasped together before him in prayer, and barely discernible grey eyes yawned from beneath the gobs of black paint that formed his face. Fire rose all around him, and a deep red moon hung in the air behind his head like a sinister halo. The painting stirred some old fear deep inside me, awakening something I hadn't felt since childhood. I was terrified. I turned to leave, and as I did, my phone lit up a giant symbol smeared across the table in blood. A circle with flared streaks rising through its center and curling in the shape of a ram's horns. And then I saw it. Under the table, placed below the center of the bloody symbol, was a head. Lifeless brown eyes gazed up at me, wide and fixed, the mouth locked open in an eternal scream. It was Stefan's dog, Leo. I could hardly speak when I returned to the front office. Liz's shock had turned to rage, and she demanded we call the police. I tentatively agreed, but changed my mind and grabbed the phone out of her hand after glancing at the computer screen. Something wasn't right with Clara Norback's file. She was paying triple the normal rate. "Try another one," Liz said, joining me next to the computer. "Try one of the units we've cracked already." I pulled Mr. Klein's file, the guy who was filming himself with his student. The rate was triple. Liz and I both came to the realization at the same time. Stefan was cracking units just like we were, except instead of reporting them, he was extorting the renters. He probably didn't even call the cops on Klein after we caught him with the girl. He probably just told him the jig was up. "That asshole!" Liz exploded. She stormed around the room, cursing and gathering her things as she went. "I'm getting the hell out of here, and I'm calling the cops." She stuck an open hand at me, awaiting the return of her phone. By the heaviness of her breath, I could tell she was a split second away from punching someone, and I was the only person around. "Just let me take a look at the ones we haven't cracked yet. I bet there's more, and maybe we can really nail him. Maybe we can get him locked up for a long time." It took a moment for Liz to calm down, but eventually she agreed and headed for the door. "I'm done," she said. "Explain it to him however you like." Then she disappeared into the night. I spent the next hour cycling through the remaining renter files. The 4th and 5th stores were mostly barren, spare a few rentals here and there, all of which were at Stefan's premium rate. But the thing that piqued my interest was a collection of 5 units, all in a row, marked off as, quote, "reserved for facility use." But what kinds of things could possibly be in there? I assumed they were for Stefan's personal stash. That night, I mustered the courage to go poke around a bit more. The memory of Leo prancing around swirled in my mind, colliding with the images of his butchered corpse scattered across a dark room. I felt like puking, but I wanted to get this sick asshole, in Leo's name. He was a good dog. One of the units had an obvious marijuana farm growing inside. Plastic tarps lined the walls to conceal the smell, and expensive UV lights and fans were meticulously organized around the room. But the grow had been recently harvested, and little, if anything, remained that could be tied to Stefan, so I moved on. Another unit was completely empty, aside from a few old paintings leaning in the corner and covered with blankets. Maybe they were stolen, but even if they were German World War II pilfered relics, They probably couldn't be tied to Stefan, so I continued my search. But after a while, I gave up and headed straight for the mystery units on the top floor. Only a single light worked in this hall. It hung solemnly in the dark, illuminating only a small cone beneath itself. Just behind it, I could barely make out a group of utility carts, arranged as a blockade, to prevent renters from passing. I carefully climbed over them, using my phone as a light. A dozen more steps through the dark took me to the reserved units. These units were different. None of them had locks at all, spare the one at the very end. The doors to the first floor were weighted shut, impossible to pry open with my scrawny arms. The master key was useless on the fifth unit. Instead of the standard police lock, it had an old, thick combination lock. I tried the address of the facility, the floor and unit number, and even the issued number printed on the back of the lock, but nothing worked. I trudged back to the front office in defeat and closed up for the night. My investigation would have to continue on my next shift. A few days later, Stefan called, offering me a few extra shifts. Apparently, Liz had told him she'd quit, which took the pressure off me to come up with a lie. I texted her and asked her how it all went down. What she said made my stomach fold over on itself. Liz had gone into work to grab a last paycheck, but Stefan told her he'd have it in a few days. On her way out, the psycho queen herself, Clara Norback, walked in with a little teacup poodle on a leash. Liz completely lost it and blew up on both of them, screaming that she knew what they were up to and that she was going to the cops. She made a good threat on her, but the cops told her they couldn't open the unit without evidence to support her accusation. And in my panicked state, I hadn't thought to take any pictures with my phone. They said they'd swing by and talk to Stefan, but she told them don't bother. I agreed to the extra shifts, but secretly, I only planned to work enough of them to nail Stefan on something substantial. Liz stopped responding to my texts that week. I knew she was beyond livid at my failure to help corroborate her claim. Friday night arrived. As I clocked in, Stefan came down from the units, sweat soaking his gross tank top and glistening on his hairy chest. It looked like he'd been moving a bunch of stuff around, probably up to no good. I tried not to make eye contact. The moment he bailed, I began my search. I rifled through his office, looking for any set of numbers he might be dumb enough to use as the passcode for the combination lock. I learned the name of his ex-wife and searched on Facebook, found a birth date and wrote it down. I wrote down more numbers Stefan had scribbled on blue sticky notes. I even wrote down 666 in the off chance he fancied himself a devil worshipper like Miss Norback. And then I saw something that made a stone fall in my throat. Minimized on Stefan's computer screen was a scanned copy of Liz's job application. I checked his browser history and found dozens of Google searches on Liz. He was trying to find anything about her. Social media, photos, family. This activity was beyond the scope of mere termination of employment. Stefan was obsessed with the girl. I jotted down Liz's birth date and grabbed a dusty flashlight out of the desk. Then I headed to the 5th floor. The corridor was pitch black. My flashlight circle fell on the single lamp that had worked on my last visit. As I passed beneath it, I saw the bulb had been removed. Further along, the utility cart blockade had been reinforced. Now a bulwark of carts, pallets, and trash cans obstructed my path. I pulled the thing down, piece by piece, no longer wondering why Stefan had been so out of breath earlier. At last, I reached the end of the hall and stared at the door to Stefan's unit. The combination lock opened with a satisfying pop. I only had to try one set of numbers. As the metal door rolled up, a gasp rushed out of me and I stumbled backwards. 4 figures sat around a table, still as death, undisturbed by my intrusion. It took a moment to process what I was seeing. As the flashlight's beam moved over the room, fragments of a picture came together in my brain. Pale limbs, stiff bodies, featureless faces. I realized they were mannequins. 4 mannequins, seated gingerly around a table, awaiting a feast. Plates and silverware had been arranged before each figure, and a bottle of wine stood in the middle. A mixture of dread and curiosity flowed through me, compelling me to enter the room. The mannequins had posable joints, unlike the ones I'd seen in department stores. An electric sensation arced down my back as I passed by the table. I imagined the creepy things reaching out and grabbing me. I imagined them flaying me and making me their meal. Behind them was a makeshift door cut into one of the wireframe walls. It seems Stefan had connected all 5 units into some kind of apartment. The next area was some sort of living room. It had a couch, a TV stand, and a painting where the television would have sat. I recognized it the moment my flashlight's beam flickered across it. The same painting I'd seen in Clara Norback's Hell House unit. Stefan must have kept it as a souvenir after giving her the boot. 2 mannequins were seated on the couch, one of them staring up at the art as if hypnotized by it. The other had its head bowed and hands clasped, sharing a dark prayer with a wicked man in the painting. Goosebumps rippled across my arms as I beheld the scene. What the hell was Stefan up to in here? Was he a part of some insane cult? Was he just a weird loner who spent his time here with his friends? The next room almost made me gag. In it, I found Mr. Klein's horrific mattress, suffused with a half-decade of every human stain imaginable. Lying atop it in a seductive repose was a female mannequin in an auburn wig, awaiting the return of her sovereignly master. She, too, was stained. Auburn, I thought. Like Liz's hair. The 4th room brimmed with a glut of old furniture, arranged in such a way as to prevent anyone from bothering to pass through it. But at this point, I felt like I knew Stefan better than anyone else in the world, and I knew there was something in that last room I needed to see. I clambered through a fortress of desks and tables and chairs and fell to the floor at the entrance to the 5th room. I'd landed on something plastic. A trash bag or a rain poncho. My light fell upon its glimmering white surface a dozen feet ahead of me. A single red line streaked its height. I followed the trail with a light, stopping at a woman's head. I staggered to my feet, light flailing in my grip. Its beam danced across the ceiling, bouncing off ribbons of blood. Then it fell again on the scene before me. The corpse of a woman sprawling inside a clawfoot tub, her arms draped over its sides, as if tossed in a display of sensuality. Even with her head tilted backward and her chin to the ceiling, her wild hair was unmistakable. It was poor Liz, who hadn't replied to my texts in days. Several layers of plastic had been wrapped around her form in a hasty attempt to preserve her, or at least to hide the smell. But the blood that smeared every inch of the tub looked new. She had died within a few hours, still wearing my sweatshirt. Everything I'd eaten all day blasted off from my stomach and came rocketing out of my mouth. I ran and threw myself into the tangle of furniture, desperate to wriggle out of the room as fast as I could. A table leg connected with my ribcage and almost knocked me out. My heart thumped in my ears like a giant wasp. The force of bile against the back of my throat returned. I flew off the stack and hit the ground, running past the praying mannequins. My foot caught on one of theirs and pulled it to the floor behind me, my mind interpreting this as one of the things crawling after me. This threw nitro on my terror engines and doubled my speed and the volume of my girlish shrieks until I blazed out of the unit and across the entire 5th floor hallway. I didn't wait for the elevator. I took the stairs. A week later, I hung up the phone with a police detective in charge of Stefan's investigation. Liz had been held captive for 48 hours and then suffocated. Her body cavity had been ritually opened and emptied. I'll never forget what he told me next. When the coroner got in there, she found a doll, a plastic baby, like the kind my little girl has. Liz had then been sewn up and redressed. The whole job looked practiced. They wondered if it wasn't Stefan's first time. The ghastly creep himself was nowhere to be found. Police said his home was mostly empty, and his car had been abandoned just outside the city limits. It took years for me to be able to walk into dark rooms after that, and years more until I stopped dreaming about Liz and Leo suffering in the dark. I don't know if enough years will ever pass until I can forgive myself for failing both of them. To this day, I still see him in my dreams. The man wreathed in shadow and flame, praying for something wicked. And each time I look out into a crowd, I wonder who among them might someday grant his next wish.